A soft voice welcomes in the half-light, and a hush settles like mist over a still lake. The greeting arrives as drift rather than declaration, a tide that slides ashore and touches the quiet edge of attention. The voice invites rest, invites. A long exhale invites the mind to loosen its knots and float. Tonight it leans toward a question that does not beg to be solved. What if Earth is just a test field, a meadow of stone and water where time watches gently? The voice wonders, softly, whether this listener wishes to linger and subscribe to more nights of quiet wandering, and then it lets the thought float away like a leaf on water. A planet turns beneath indifferent stars, and the starlight asks for nothing. Oceans hold the sky's memory in patient ripples. If a test takes place here, perhaps it resembles a garden more than a laboratory. Seeds are placed, not instruments. Observation grows like moss on a shaded wall. What is being tested? The chemistry of patience, the arithmetic of change, the willingness of matter to keep trying. Held in the palm of geology, a zircon the size of a grain of sand carries hints of vanished oceans and early coolness. Within that speck, elements align like a ledger of conditions: heat, water, pressure, time. The voice imagines crystals as scorecards slipped into the planet's pockets. If stone remembers, perhaps remembering itself is the test, and the field is an archive that writes and rewrites its own quiet rules. Tectonic plates wander like slow-thinking creatures, meeting and parting in intervals wider than any story can. Hold, they dive and rise, erasing and revealing as they go. Much of what once existed slips under another page and warms to silence. The crust becomes a notebook that edits itself. It does not cling to drafts. Durable sentences climb into mountains and beaches while the rest dissolves back into fire. INI. The dark bellies of oceans. Vents pulse mineral-rich water into night. Around those chimneys, life solves its first riddles again and again. How to gather energy, how to keep a boundary, how to persist amid flow. Minerals offer surfaces like quiet tutors arranging and rearranging molecules. If clay can teach carbon to speak in patterns, then mind may be a late echo of mineral logic, a melody begun in stone and only later sung within cells. Ice stores breath. Deep cores hold bubbles that taste of ancient skies, the way a pressed flower holds spring. Those trapped atmospheres read like marginalia, notes about warmth and dust, rhythm and pause. Glaciers advance and retreat, and in their stepping the planet marks time with a pale metronome. The moon keeps time with a patient pull. Extinction arrives not as punishment, but as weather. Impact, flood basalt, sudden bloom, and sudden hunger. The fossil record flickers, a long film with missing frames. Each pause is also a reset, and after each reset, life tries again, recombining the same small alphabet into new sentences. Perhaps the field is compassionate. It allows retakes. Or perhaps there is no examiner at all, only matter testing every path it can find, eventually stumbling upon awareness the way rivers find deltas. The surface breathes through forests that shimmer like green oceans and deserts that turn dunes into migrating equations. Leaves harvest light with a precision rivaling any crafted machine. Stomata open and close. Water rises, sugars knit. The atmosphere shifts. Sand, meanwhile, writes, wind in slow calligraphy. At night, cities sketch constellations on the ground. If someone watches, what do they watch for? The crisp edge of green where chlorophyll declares itself. Waste heat pooling over stone like a low fog at twilight. Perhaps the field simply asks whether a biosphere can announce itself and still dream. Skepticism arrives like a careful friend and sits beside the bed of thought. If an earlier industry once rose and vanished, it might leave whispers rather than proclamations. Odd isotope ratios, thin soot, anachronistic alloys abraded into pebbles by a million storms. A test field, if real, would not ask belief. It would ask attention, eyes that linger on seams in cliffs, minds that notice the chemistry of clay and the rhythm of ash. Across the canvas of time, celestial patterns move like understated supervisors. Orbits stretch and relax, axes tilt and quiver, cycles beat quietly against climate. Cosmic rays drift in, sometimes more, sometimes less, a rain of messages that never state a purpose. Influence does not require instruction. A field may be shaped by many hands that never touch, the way the moon moves oceans without laying a finger on the sea. No announcement accompanies such a possibility. A field does not declare itself a field. It is named by those who walk in it, or by no one at all. Basalt plains and coral shelves, rain shadows and river fans proceed as if observation does not matter, and yet they make room for observers. The planet appears indifferent and deeply hospitable at once. The question grows larger than any answer it could hold. If Earth is just a test field, then the word just becomes tender rather than dismissive. A field is where growth happens without rush, where experiments are planted and read in their own seasons, and sometimes forgotten before their meaning becomes clear. A slow wind moves through high grass. Measurements are made by rustling and shadow more than by digits. Breath deepens. Attention loosens. Names soften and slip toward textures. Rough granite, cool water, the mild buzz of a leaf in sun. Somewhere beyond cloud and ionosphere, the planet sails a faint road of dust, turning, and turning old and new in every moment. If tests unfold here, they unfold the way rain unfurls from vapor, inevitably, gently, with endless variation. The field continues without fanfare, open and unafraid of silence. A closing thought for this beginning passes like starlight through a window. The voice does not know who, if anyone, waits for a result. It only knows that attending to this world is its own blessing, as though attention completes a circuit the way a fingertip completes the memory of a stone. The listener eases into stillness. Rest gathers at the edges of thought. Night leans in. The story breathes, and the field keeps turning. The voice settles on a single grain, a tiny crystal that fits inside the shadow of an eyelash. It rests in imagination the way it rests in a geologist's slide, caught in a thin mount of resin, polished until its inner weather becomes visible. The grain is zircon, a mineral that resists forgetting. It forms in liquid rock, cools, and keeps a ledger in its lattice. Uranium joins the crystal at birth, lead is unwelcome, and so time writes itself by substitution. Slowly, invisibly, one nucleus becoming another, while the lattice holds its shape like a calm breath. The crystal becomes a clock that carries its own instructions. Under light, growth zones appear like faint tree rings, a history not in words but in chemistry. Oxygen isotopes lean one way, hafnium another. Their ratios whisper about the environment that surrounded each layer as it grew. One zone hints at interaction with liquid water, as though the crystal once cooled inside rock touched by rain-fed rivers or ancient seas. Another suggests remelting, stress, a journey through heat that did not erase the memory. Zircon survives what destroys most records: metamorphism, weather, the long digestion of subduction, and this stubbornness allows it to pass tiny notes across eons. The voice imagines the planet keeping score not in judgments but in conditions: temperature, pressure, fluids, sources of the melt. All leave marks that the crystal carries forward. A field does not grade its wildflowers. It remembers how much rain fell and from which wind the seeds arrived. Zircon seems to do something like that. It holds the evidence that continental crust exists early, that water visits rock early, that habitability is not a late flourish but an overture. In this way, the crystal offers a question. If Earth is a test field, are crystals the field's patient instruments, taking readings without intention, like dew taking the temperature of dawn? The crystal's surface shows minute fractures, healed over during some later event, then fractured again. Microscopic inclusions dot the interior, specks of quartz, mica, sometimes even diamond, each inclusion a second voice inside the first, agreeing or complicating the story. The voice lingers on that idea. A story inside a story. Test within. Test. Perhaps a zircon grows, crystallizes, traps an inclusion, then rides a river, becomes sand, gets buried, melts, and grows again, adding layers like seasons. In each phase, the lattice notes something different, like a notebook carried through storms, its pages smudged but still legible if opened with care. Oceans play a background role in this mineral ballet. Their presence changes the chemistry of crustal melts. Their circulation moves heat across the globe. Their salt remembers the taste of continents. If early zircons carry an oxygen signature consistent with water-altered rock, then water appears in the story as an early character. This does not prove intention. It proves possibility. A field does not announce that the rain is part of an experiment. Rain falls, roots drink, crystals cool. Yet the pattern can be read. Someone who cares to notice can hold a tiny, ancient grain and taste the possibility of oceans older than comfort would guess. Concrete and brick weather to gravel and clay, then pass as quietly as the sandstones and mudstones they become. Yet ports and dams change sediment budgets, and the geometry of coastlines becomes briefly angular. Where rivers once braided freely, embankments narrow channels, and a core reads that constriction as a sudden fineness in grains, a spike in silt where a delta once grew coarser with flood. Later, when the embankments fail, the pattern relaxes. The layer acts like a held breath in the stratigraphy, a pause in the normal dance of sizes. The field notes pauses. It does not accuse. Radionuclids speak in a shorter tongue. Their half-lives measure in thousands to a few million years, a flicker on the long scale. Plutonium and cesium bloom and fade, leaving at best a subtle disequilibrium in daughter products, a ghost that grows fainter with each doubling of time. A civilization that ends long before the next supercontinent assembles may still seed a brief spike that future readers could find if their tools are delicate and their luck generous. If the industry lies deep in geologic past, the ghost likely vanishes, leaving no more than a rearranged lattice here, a slightly odd ratio there, indistinguishable from other small storms of energy in stone. Combustion marks ice and peat with soot, a black snow that settles in annual bands. Under magnification, the soot arrives as lace and shards and the perfection of tiny spheres. But wildfire also sows such confetti, and flood basalts cast their own dark pollen on the wind. Distinguishing hands requires a chorus of proxies: carbon lightness, metal ensembles, nitrogen inflections, spheroidal soot, and a synchrony across continents tight enough to suggest connectedness rather than coincidence. An industry breathes in networks. Volcanoes breathe in episodes and provinces. The timing reveals character the way cadence reveals speaker. Magnetism offers a metronome for dating. Reversals stripe the seabed and bake into lavas. Cores link those stripes to years by counting microfossil families and seasonal laminations. If an industrial bloom rises, peaks, and declines on the scale of centuries to millennia, its mark may appear as a narrow brushstroke between magnetic waypoints, the kind of thin event that stratigraphers name with a careful modesty. A test field appreciates such modesty. It prefers marks that whisper rather than shout, as if to remind any reader that attention is a form of kindness. The thought of an earlier industry pulls gently toward a more ancient register, the one that gives this question its name in the popular mind, Silurian shadows cast backward into Paleozoic seas. In the imagination, an industrious creature works the watery margin of a long-vanished shoreline, leaves behind a pulse of carbon lightness, a scattering of spheres, a rearrangement of nitrogen and metals, then disappears beneath the normal operations of weather and time. The rocks blur in tension with process. Life blooms, life organizes, life burns things, life forgets. The field keeps moving. Against this drift, skepticism sits like a stone of good shape in a pocket. Similar signals bloom in the Paleocene warming, in ocean anoxic events, in the breathy aftermath of impacts, in the convulsions of large igneous provinces. The signals stack, mimic, and echo. The test for industry, if such a test exists, cannot be a single bell struck once in a storm. It must be a chord impossible for volcano and algae to play alone, or else the test remains ungraded, beautifully so, leaving the question open like a window at night. In that openness, the voice sees geologists as careful listeners more than judges. They lower cylinders into seabeds, lift out time still damp at the edges, and read. They polish tiny sections and let light travel through them until lattices speak. They tally ratios with machines that count whispers. Their work resembles a meditation. Repeated, patient, willing to be wrong, content with small certainties that make room for wonder. The field responds by yielding a few more hints, then closing again like a shell. The listener rests in this not knowing. A planet may host many rehearsals without announcing a premiere. It may scatter the traces of intention so broadly that intention becomes indistinguishable from exuberance. The exuberance of carbon, of sunlight, of cycles that find every gradient and run along it until the slope softens. If an earlier hand writes in stone, its script drifts toward the natural idiom, the way a borrowed melody becomes folk. The question continues, unhurried. What faint isotopic sighs remain, and how softly do they breathe? The answer remains a breeze. Across a core's surface, a slight coolness where a gloved finger passes, a curve on a plot that looks like others and yet not quite. The field keeps its poise. The night deepens. Breath anchors to the slow counting of years sealed in mud. The story holds still long enough for curiosity to sit beside it, silent, companionable, awake to the possibility that absence can be as eloquent as any find. The voice turns to the crust itself, to the slow patience of stone that learns by erasing and remembers by layering. A planet writes with fire and water, with pressure and drift. It keeps a notebook that can fold itself shut and later unfold. Pages rearranged by forces so steady they pass for stillness. If Earth is a test field, this is its ledger. Slabs that dive, mountains that lift, basins that open like quiet mouths to receive what rivers bring, and an oceanic skin that renews with the rhythm of breath. Continents move with a calm insistence. Beneath them, warm rock circulates like sleep beneath eyelids, carrying heat outward, drawing cooler rock down. Mid-ocean ridges open along long seams, and magma wells up to knit new floor, banded with iron crystals that align with the planet's field, their tiny compass needles frozen at birth. As polarity wanders and reverses, stripes gather on either side of the ridge, a barcode of time laid across the deep. Later, subduction takes those same slabs under at trenches, where cold lithosphere descends like a page being tucked away. In that descent, water bound in minerals releases, lowering melting points, feeding arcs of volcanoes that glow faintly along the edges of seas. The writing of basalt becomes the writing of andesite. The cycle turns a page. On continents, the script looks different. Cratons, old hearts of land, sit like thick, cool islands rooted deep, buoyant as wood on water. Around them, younger belts crumple and heal, sutures stitching wandering terrains into larger bodies. Orogeny arrives as collision softened by time until it feels less like impact and more like rearrangement. Mountains rise, snow and rain begin their patient audit, loosening grains from peaks, carrying them to plains, teaching height to become distance. Rivers keep a record in motion, sand, silt and clay braided into bars and floodplains. When those sediments settle for long enough, the water's sentence stones itself, and the basin holds a chapter of former weather. Unconformities interrupt with eloquent gaps. An angular unconformity shows tilted beds shaved flat and covered. Again, history sliced and reset, tilt beneath plain like a quiet afterthought. A nonconformity lays new sand across ancient crystalline basement, as if spreading a blanket over old bones. A disconformity hides a missing chapter between parallel pages. Its absence speaks through subtle mismatches, through fossils above and below that refuse to meet. The crust edits itself without apology. What remains is not a continuous script, but a selection. Moments saved because they found shelter from heat, from uplift, from the blind appetite of subduction. Metamorphism writes in the margins with a new hand, under heat and pressure. Slate becomes phyllite, then schist, then gneiss, foliation tightening like careful handwriting. In subduction complexes, blueskisses glow with glaucophane, a cool signature born of high pressure and low temperature. Deeper still, eclogites sparkle with garnet and omphacite, dense testimonies that oceanic basalt has journeyed into the mantle's dusk. Each assemblage records a path through pressure and heat, a journey inscribed in mineral balance the way a breath pattern records a mood. Ophiolites speak on behalf of vanished seas. Slices of ocean crust and upper mantle raised onto land reveal a stack. Peridotite at the base, layered gabbros above, then sheeted dikes, then pillows of basalt, then a thin cap of pelagic muds. To walk across one is to move from mantle to water-laid, silt in an afternoon, to read in kilometers what the planet writes in millions of years. The notebook opens wide here, its binding visible, its basaltic handwriting shaped into globes that cooled under seawater and froze their curves in stone. Granites cool slowly in the roots of mountains, coarse, generous, crystalline. Quartz catches light. Feldspar weathers to clays that welcome roots. Micas peel like thin ash leaves. Basalts, by contrast, spill in quick, dark sheets, feeding broad plains and building islands that ring with surf. Between them, andesites and diorites tell the mixed story of convergent margins, a compromise written in silica and water, in volatile-rich melts rising from subducted slabs and their warmed mantles. Each rock type composes a clause in the crusts, grammar telling who melted, how deeply, how fast, and in whose company. The crust keeps time without hours. It uses cycles instead, Wilson cycles that gather continents and later let them drift. A supercontinent assembles, winds reroute, deserts spread like pale wings across interiors. Then the mass loosens, rifts open, basins flood, and new shorelines multiply. Shallow epicontinental seas invite reefs and carbonate platforms to construct their patient architectures, layer upon layer of sunlight translated into stone. The notebook thickens along these margins, where life and sediment meet in long, repeating phrases. Volcanic provinces sometimes lay exclamation marks, flood basalts that run for hundreds of kilometers, lacing air with ash and sulfur. Their marks are bold but still subject to weather's eraser. Ash falls into lakes and oceans as paper-thin lights in the stack, later used as time pins, datable horizons that synchronize stories told by distant basins. Even the dramatic entries become gentle tools for correlation. The writing refuses spectacle. It asks instead to be read side by side, quietly. Fossils give the ledger an index of forms. Shells dissolve and leave molds that fill with spar. Leaves press their delicate veins. Into shale. Bones trade their matter for silica or calcite and learn to endure. These images travel with plates, riding continents through latitudes and climates, carrying whispers of warm shallows into cooler times, carrying traces of forests across longitudes until those forests are long gone. Life writes itself into stone, and then hands the pen to rivers and sand. Magmatism, metamorphism, and sedimentation interleave like breaths in a sleeping body. Extension thins a crust and encourages basaltic speech. Compression thickens and warms, generating granitic reply. Weather and water translate both into clastic whispers. The ledger holds all three modes without hierarchy. It does not prefer basalt over sand or schist over limestone. It allows each to record what only it can know: depth, heat, flow, pause, and arranges their testimonies in cross-cutting relationships that give order without insistence. A dike slices a sandstone and so must be younger. A river channel meanders through a volcanic plain and so must come after the fire. A metamorphic overprint blurs a fossil and so must follow the life that left it. The notebook teaches sequence by the gentle logic of overlap. The voice wonders whether such a notebook implies a reader beyond those who happen to evolve upon its surface. Perhaps writing is what cycles do when left alone. Any system with memory leaves a mark, and Earth's marks happen to be rocks. If so, then the test field is simply this: can cycles preserve enough of themselves that later cycles can learn? Rivers remember glaciers by the shape of their valleys. Soils remember forests by their dark softness. Reefs remember seas by their pale staircases. Mountains remember collisions by the angle of their folds. Human hands, when they arrive, only learn to feel what the crust already knows. Cities, when they arise, join the notebook briefly. They quarry stones and rearrange grains, pour melted sand into glass that will return to sand. Their foundations rest on unconformities they rarely notice, and their shadows fall across rocks that have endured many such moments of sudden geometry. When cities fail or shift, the ledger absorbs them without strain. Concrete crumbles to aggregate. Steel rusts to hematite that the crust has always understood. The record keeps its tone, undramatic, continuous even in its gaps. This patience offers a lesson in gentle attention. To read stone is to accept partial stories, to cherish the way absence opens space for wonder instead of haste. It is to stand before a cliff and feel time as an element, ambient like temperature, drifting like scent, rather than a countdown. It is to recognize that erasure is not failure, that forgetting is part of how memory stays alive, constantly refreshed by new entries and new layers. A page is removed so another may be written. A valley deepens so a delta can begin. The page closes softly. Somewhere a ridge continues to spread. Somewhere a trench swallows another ribbon of cold floor. Somewhere a mountain loses one more grain to a stream that carries it to a sea that will turn it to rock again. The notebook never finishes and never begins. It always is, written in present tense by processes that do not hurry and do not rest. The voice lingers with that sense, and the listener's breath gently matches it, slow and tidal. Whether anyone tests this field or no one does, the crust continues to write, and the writing itself feels like the lesson. The voice turns its attention upward to the thin, elastic cloak that surrounds the field and moves in silence. Air presses, gently against ocean and stone, an unseen lake whose surface is everywhere. It enters leaves and lungs, glides along dune faces, curls around mountain shoulders, then rises in sunlit columns to stitch the sky to the ground. If Earth is a test field, the experiment may begin here, with a chemistry learning how to breathe itself into balance. At first, the breath looks different. Early gases exhale from rock, steam, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, sulfurous companions that taste of magma and hot water. Sunlight splinters molecules. Space drinks the lightest fragments. With time, the cloak thickens into a steadier composition, and water condenses into rain that falls for centuries, floods the basins, makes seas. In that rain, the breath begins to slow, to hold itself, to smooth extremes. In that holding, opportunity opens. Life steps into the breath and changes it by existing. Tiny cells drink carbon dioxide and release oxygen the way a leaf sighs in daylight. Iron in oceans rusts as if surprised, falling as bands of mineral that later lift into cliffs striped with ancient weather. Sulfur gases in the air lose their mass-independent quirks. Ozone gathers like a delicate shield against harsh ultraviolet. The atmosphere shifts from an indulgent mix for chemistry to a home for physiology. Breathing becomes a partnership between air and metabolism, a handshake across membranes. The balance does not arrive cleanly. Methane drifts into sky from swamps and seeps. Haze may bloom and cool the globe as sunlight scatters. Ice expands, then retreats. Continents rearrange winds and currents. Volcanoes offer sudden exhalations that the breath must absorb. Through each swing, the cloak recalibrates. It adjusts ratios, thickens and thins the veil of greenhouse warmth, invites clouds. To attend more or less, a field learns by trial, and this field's trials move in cycles long enough to be mistaken for calm. Nitrogen, quiet and abundant, fills the room like a steady bass note. It passes through fire and rain with little change, yet its fixed form, nitrates, in soil and sea, nourishes growth that in turn reshapes the breath. Bacteria thread nitrogen into organic fabric, then loosen it again, returning gas to sky. Lightning writes a thin line of fixation in storms. Human industry amplifies that line into a chorus. Rivers carry the echo to coasts where oxygen slumps, and is later restored, a slow inhalation after a localized sigh. Carbon moves with a more visible rhythm, a heartbeat that registers in ice bubbles and in the pores of leaves. When carbon dioxide rises, stomata on leaves tend to narrow. When it falls, they open wider. Fossil leaves preserve these choices, and their densities tell a part of the breath's story. Ice remembers more directly. Bubbles capture the blend of air at the moment of their burial. Tiny time capsules that whisper the concentration of gases as centuries pile above them. The breath keeps a ledger in its own body. A thermostat hides in rock and rain. Carbon dioxide dissolves in water, forms weak acid, weathers silicate minerals, and finds its way to ocean as bicarbonate, later locked into carbonate rocks, later returned by volcanoes. The loop takes millions of years and acts like a gentle counterweight. When the planet warms, weathering quickens and draws more carbon down. When it cools, weathering relaxes, allowing volcanic exhalations to accumulate. No overseer sets this dial. It turns because chemistry loves equilibrium and landscapes love flow. Oxygen remains the most vivid signature of breath. With it, combustion becomes easy and metabolisms run hot. Without it, fire slumbers and energy systems seek other routes. For long ages, oxygen lingers near the threshold where oceans can swing between breathing and holding their breath. Later, trees and plankton weave enough oxygen into air to support large animals, to invite flame into ecosystems as a sculptor of edges. Too much oxygen and even wet wood may flare. Too little and flame retreats. The field navigates between. The breath makes a spectrum visible to distant eyes. Certain gases absorb certain colors. If a watcher across light years takes a patient look, the cloak reveals its composition as subtle slumps in starlight when the planet passes in front. Oxygen pairs with ozone. Methane, if present with oxygen, suggests a tension that life likes to maintain. The disequilibrium reads like a melody that chemistry alone rarely plays for long. Whether anyone listens or no one does, the song continues, encoded in photons that leave for the dark. Cities add new notes, a pulse of carbon from buried fuels, faint glows of nitrogen compounds, halos of heat that lift at night like soft steam. Satellites capture these patterns as a moving lace of brightness. Spectrometers taste the breath from orbit and register its small changes. The atmosphere responds the way water does when a pebble falls. Ripples spread, diminish, blend with older ripples. If the field tests anything, it may test how quickly cycles absorb surprise, how elastic the cloak remains under steady nudge. Ocean breath and sky breath interlace. Algae inhale carbon and exhale oxygen. When they die, a fraction sinks, carrying carbon into depths where it may sleep for centuries. Upwelling returns some to light. The rest travels to sediment and stone. Winds pick up sea salt and dim sunlight with veils of aerosol. Clouds condense around these salts and adjust the planet's brightness. The breath is not a single lung but a network of lungs exchanging with one another, from pore to wave to plume. The moon stirs the breath from below through tides that move heat and salt, altering where and when the ocean exhales. Mountains steer wind like stones shaping a river. Forests cool air by sweating water into it. Deserts lift dust that seeds clouds and feeds plankton far away. The cloak records these interactions wordlessly, as only balance and imbalance. It carries the scent of pine and sea in the same grammar as it carries volcanic ash and cometary dust. In deep time, the breath meanders through thresholds that matter for life. Oxygen low, then high, greenhouse thick, then thin. Each threshold is less a door than a fog line, a region where feedbacks change sign and push becomes pull. The field wanders in and out of these fog lines, sometimes lingering, sometimes passing through. Life adjusts. Leaves redesign their pores. Enzymes shift their diets. Skeletons choose aragonite or calcite depending on seawater mood. Breath and body co-evolve, each reading the other as text. The voice pauses on a gentle thought. Perhaps breathing is the planet's way of thinking out loud. Gases compose a sentence that means nothing and everything, a statement of conditions that life continues to edit. If thought is defined as sensitivity and response, then atmosphere and biosphere together learn by improvisation, seeking a tempo that can hold storms and droughts, fires and freezes, without losing the thread. The test, if there is one, remains open-ended, graded only by continuity. Night deepens. Air cools. The planet releases what it held in daylight. The breath slows across forests and cities alike. Dew gathers on roofs and leaves. Faint inversions settle in valleys like folded blankets. Above, winds keep watch, tireless, unjudging. The cloak persists, delicate and strong, a chemistry that has learned, slowly, imperfectly, to cradle persistence. Whether anyone outside notices, the breath goes on, and in going on, it writes the field's most intimate chapter in a language of quiet molecules. The voice leans toward water that never sleeps, water that covers more story than land can hold. Out beyond the continental shelves, where light thins to a blue thought and then to a velvet without color, the planet keeps its quiet ledger. A slow rain falls there, bits of plankton shells, flecks of dust blown from deserts, shards of volcanic ash, the faint soot of fires, the faint glitter of shattered diatoms, pellets pressed together by creatures who eat and drift and settle. It is a gentle snow, darker than winter, constant as pulse. On the abyssal plains, this snow becomes memory. Grain meets grain and presses softly, year by year, until layers thicken and turn to pages. The archive is not loud. It accrues with the patience of a held breath, sometimes a millimeter in 1,000 years, sometimes less, sometimes more where margins crumble and submarine canyons pour. Turbidites rush downhill like heavy fogs, leave graded beds that fine, upward in a single elegant fade. Then the quiet returns and the slow rain continues. Contour currents comb edges and sculpt drifts. Icebergs release their pockets of pebbles and sand that settle as sudden freckles, ice-rafted debris, hinting at winters long and deep. All this collects in a calm that looks like silence, but is actually the planet practicing how to remember. Life writes most of the script. Microscopic foraminifera build calcareous chambers, beautiful spirals and spires, then release them to the fall. Diatoms frame themselves in glass and take the light into silicon lattices, then die and add their frost to the bed. Coccolithophores, snow chalk platelets so thoroughly that in some ages a bright cliff may someday rise where sea now lies, a solidified blizzard of plates that once spun on the skin of waves. Radiolarians etch their own glassy puzzles and loosen them to the descent. Each form keeps a temperature in the shape of its chemistry. Oxygen isotopes shift with cold and heat. Magnesium blends into calcite as waters warm. Lipids in some plankton become more or less kinked with surface temperature. The unsaturation a thermometer written in oil. The field does not announce a measuring device. It grows one and lets it fall. As the particles sink, they gather stories from the path. Sticky threads, transparent and messy, tie crumbs together into marine snow. Bacteria ride the clusters, harvest. What's easy? Change the redox of tiny pockets. Make small halos where oxygen thins, where nitrate and sulfate take their turns. Fecal pellets form, small and neat, adding weight and speed to the journey. At depth, shells that resist dissolve in waters that favor them. Shells that do not resist vanish at the invisible borderlines, the lacicline, the carbonate compensation depth, where chemistry turns and says not here. The result is a map of materials by depth. Below certain horizons, chalk becomes whisper. Above them, it speaks clearly, and so the archive sorts itself by solubility, a quiet curation. On the seafloor, the first editors arrive. Worms and little. Crustaceans burrow and stir, mix the top few centimeters into a gentle blur. Bioturbation smudges the sharpness of single seasons like a fingertip across pencil. Where oxygen remains, this mixing continues. Where oxygen leaves and sulfidic waters lift like night, the pens stop. Laminations form, thin, delicate, annual, sometimes even seasonal, each line a tide of particles laid and protected. In such places, Varve-like bands remember a year with a precision the open ocean rarely keeps. The Black Sea holds pages like that, tender and crisp. The deep Mediterranean keeps black intervals, sap propels, when monsoons strengthen and rivers feed. The sea until breath grows thin below. The archive breathes in long lines of dark and pale. Elsewhere, the ocean chooses another handwriting. Red clays spread across the deepest plains, iron-tinged and sparse, a dust diary kept far from coasts. Manganese nodules bloom like slow planets. On the seabed, grow ring by pulling trace metals from water, a concretion of slowness that recounts chemistry at the gentlest pace, millimeters in a million years. Even these stones, crouched in darkness, keep an outline of the field's experiment. Whether cycles can settle, whether balance can hold for spans that dwarf concern. Signals of surprise punctuate the quiet. Tephra, volcanic glass and crystals, arrives. As pale layers that cross oceans and lock time the way a thin pin fixes fabric. Distant fires leave soot that grows and fades with climates. Dust from expanding deserts lays a fine tan veil that thickens during cold and thins during warm, speaking, of winds and dryness, of continents shifting their voices, freshwater floods from ice sheet lakes, catastrophes that pour into the Atlantic, leave changes in foraminifera species and in the salty weight of the water itself, recorded as ratios in shells. The archive does not dramatize. It nods and continues. The voice drifts to the instruments that coax these whispers into numbers. A cylinder of mud rises from the deck dripping with time. Its colors change from chocolate to gray to olive as oxygen disappears downward. Splits reveal faint bands, speckles of shell, flecks of glass. A microscope shows a snowy storm of tests. A mass spectrometer listens for the breath in calcite. A gas chromatograph tastes ancient oceans inside oils made by algae under a sun that still climbs each morning. D18O shivers with ice volume and temperature. McShay tightens the estimate. Alkanones and archaeolipids add another angle on warmth. Each method is a question folded into a measurement. Together they knit a climate from crumbs. The planet's memory stretches beyond weather. Ocean anoxic events puncture the archive. With thick, dark pages, black shales born when productivity surges and circulation slows, when the surface lives so wildly that the depth cannot keep up. Iron precipitates as pyrite under sulfur's rule. Trace metals concentrate in ways that normal seas avoid. These episodes arrive with volcanic largesse, with continental arrangements that bottle deep waters, with long breath holds the ocean, performs and then releases. The field asks, perhaps, how often exuberance tips into suffocation and how quickly rebound returns oxygen to the books. Downslope and along margins, fans spread where rivers enter the deep. Canyons slice the shelf. Landslides rumble, then sleep. The writing here is bold, energetic, braided with sand-proud pulses and silt-rich fades. Farther out, the style returns to minimalism. A thin silt here, a test there, the faintest drift of dust settled in a stillness so complete that the compasses of tiny magnetic grains sometimes align with Earth's field as they fall, leaving a paleomagnetic whisper that allows time to be counted even where fossil clocks fall silent. The page is never empty. It only varies its ink. Oceanic memory does not belong to water alone. It speaks with the continents through rivers that carry shredded mountains, with the atmosphere through dust and ash, with the biosphere through shells and oils, with the mantle through helium and strontium that seep into basalts and leak into seawater's ratios. Every exchange leaves a residue that can be read if one accepts that clarity trades places with ambiguity, that signals overlap, and songs harmonize without soloists. The field seems to test not just life, but interpretation, inviting minds to calm themselves enough to see patterns as invitations rather than verdicts. Skepticism sits calmly beside awe. The same D13C curve that might hum of industry also hums when oceans stratify for other reasons. The same metal enrichments that lean toward pollution also bloom in oxygen-poor basins without cities. Bioturbation blurs the edges one wishes to keep. Dissolution erases shells one hopes to measure. Yet across basins, across methods, across species, a shared shape can appear, a gentle synchrony between distant cores, a coherence that suggests the planet moves as a single breathing body. The lesson is less that memory is perfect and more that memory is abundant. The voice lets this accumulate like silt. Imagined cores stand in a row, each a column of ocean time lifted through air. Their tops smell faintly of sulfur and salt. Their bases smell of stone. A fingertip finds a soft band and pauses, the way a reader pauses at a line that returns a feeling. If Earth is a test field, perhaps these cores are its kindly report cards. Not grades, not judgments, simply traces of attempts, blooms that worked until they didn't, circulations that held until they wavered, thresholds entered and then left. Each layer says, we tried this, and then this, and then this, and the trying continues. Night surrounds the sea without pressing on it. Somewhere above, waves wrinkle star maps. Somewhere below, a nodule grows by a breath of manganese. In between, snow falls without a sound anyone hears. The archive lengthens, a bed made by the persistence of falling. The voice exhale is slow, like the settling of a flake on another flake. Nothing concludes. Memory spreads. The planet does not decide to remember. It remembers because it cannot help it. The listener drifts with that knowledge, buoyed by the idea that the quietest rooms hold the longest stories, and that the ocean has been writing them all along. Night gathers at the seafloor, a night without stars, a night lit instead by pale ghosts of chemistry. Out of cracks in basalt, hot water exhales, laced with metals and the breath of rock. Chimneys rise where fluids meet ocean, mineral by mineral, a city of pillars that smolder without flame. The water carries heat and hydrogen, sulfide and methane. Whispers of the mantle's interior mingled with the memory of seawater that wandered downward and returned altered. Here, at midnight in the deep, the field practices beginnings. There are vents that burn dark, black smokers, where temperatures soar and fluids carry iron and copper in invisible solution until contact with cold makes particles bloom like smoke. And there are cooler, alkaline vents, pale and chalky, where pH runs high and water slips through mazes of carbonate and brucite, a honeycomb of warm pores. The chimneys in such places build themselves from chemistry, not from hand, layer upon layer of precipitated mineral that yields a labyrinth of tiny compartments. The architecture arrives without architect. Walls thin as paper, separate fluids slightly different from one another, and across those thin bones, gradients form, differences in pH, in redox, in temperature, tiny slopes that energy loves to descend. Serpentinization hums below, an old reaction of olivine greeting water with a soft exothermic embrace. The rock hydrates, swells, turns greenish and slick. Hydrogen bubbles from its working like a quiet laughter in stone. That hydrogen meets carbon dioxide dissolved from seawater and offers to push it toward lifelike molecules, formate, acetate, methanethiol, intermediates that modern microbes still coax into their diets. Metal sulfides, maconite and greigite, line. The pores like catalysts waiting for a cue, their crystals assembling little iron-sulfur motifs that resemble the cores of enzymes used by cells today. It is easy to imagine a continuity between mineral lattice and protein cluster, between a vent wall and the heart of metabolism, even as certainty remains out of reach. Within the pores, a natural battery persists. Alkaline fluids hold a surplus of hydroxide. The surrounding ocean is more acidic by comparison. Across the thin walls, protons yearn to move, and in moving, they offer work. Energy in biology often rides such gradients, protons slipping through molecular turbines that knit, ATP, the metabolic coin. Here, before machines, the gradient itself exists, powered by geology. It is a gentle thought that the field provides not just ingredients but a soft push, a voltage available for those chemistries that can catch it. In this setting, carbon finds patience. On metal sulfide surfaces, carbon dioxide reduces stepwise, sometimes to carbon monoxide, sometimes to small organics that cling to mineral faces and try combinations. The surfaces act like workbenches, holding reactants near, aligning them with just enough rigidity to favor certain bonds. The outcome varies with temperature and metal and flow, but again and again the chemistry leans toward the motifs that life later favors: acetyl groups, thioesters, small acids that can donate and accept fragments like notes passed in class. No oversight command sequence. The pattern emerges from gradients and surfaces, from the calm insistence of energetics. Elsewhere in the labyrinth, lipids gather, Fatty acids assemble spontaneously into spheres when salts and conditions consent, their tails hiding from water, their heads greeting it. Vesicles form and pop, merge and divide, a restless choreography that turns compartments into a property of matter, not mind. In the warm throats of pores, concentration rises as flows cycle. Thermophoresis nudges larger molecules toward cooler spots. The labyrinth sorts without planning. A membrane here, a mineral there, a gradient always. Conditions for cycles that can repeat, that can improve merely by persisting. Clays arrive in the imagination as tutors of sequence. Montmorillonite, layered and charged, welcomes nucleotides along its surfaces and encourages them to link, a gentle catalysis of chains that might one day speak. Ribose sugars find form with difficulty, but within mineral pockets and on certain catalysts, possibilities multiply. In labs far from the vent's darkness, droplets grow polymer strands on clays, short sequences that fold and sometimes act on themselves. The echo is not perfect, but it is suggestive. Mineral order templating molecular order, as if the field teaches grammar before meaning. Another pathway hums in the background, an ancient route that modern microbes still use, a carbon-fixing cycle that knits acetyl groups from gases and electrons, often powered by iron-sulfur clusters. The enzymes that do this now are elaborate, precise, alive. The minerals that echo their cores are simple, repetitive, indifferent. Between them, a bridge of speculation spans the gulf with care. Perhaps parts of metabolism begin as geochemistry, made hereditary, surface reactions captured by compartments, ratcheted into reliability by chain and membrane, copied because function favors continuation. In such a scene, the test, if there is one, looks like repetition. Vents bloom and die. Chimneys build, clog, fall, flows reroute, chemistry migrates to adjacent pores. The network resets again and again on scales of decades and centuries, while serpentinization carries on beneath for longer stretches, and plate motion reconfigures the program every few million years. The cycles ensure trials are many. Failures are cheap and quiet. Partial successes linger in new forms. The way a slightly more stable vesicle may last long enough to divide, the way a slightly more effective catalyst may coax one more bond. Before dispersing, the deep present does not only host prelude. Entire ecosystems gather here, luminous with chemosynthesis. Tube worm plumes wave like soft flags. Clams nestle in chimneys' lee. Microbial mats paint surfaces with films that glisten under ROV lights. These forms invent their lives from chemical energy rather than sun. And yet the principle persists. Gradients, flows, and surfaces sustain improbability. The modern scene does not prove a beginning. It demonstrates a living option, a stable marriage of rock and water that continues to write its own script. A question spreads through this dark laboratory like heat through a vent throat. If matter can learn to sustain cycles that feed on gradients and reproduce their conditions, how many steps are required before the cycles read as life? The answer remains mist. Chains grow and hydrolyze. Vesicles divide and lose coherence. RNA, if it forms, acts with clumsiness and promise. Enzymes, if they appear, arise from a long apprenticeship of selection. The field provides patience, not blueprints. It provides persistence of conditions that make trying cheap, that make trying inevitable. Chemists return again and again to these themes in controlled rooms, building benches from iron sulfide, pumping hydrogen and carbon dioxide in measured pulses, watching for acetates and pyruvates to appear. They grow alkaline chimneys in aquarium, glass, and let fluids percolate through pores to test whether proton gradients can indeed be harnessed by simple catalysts. They sprinkle lipids into warm, salty water and add clays and cycles of drying and wetting. The results are incremental, scattered, partial, like microfossils of theory. Each success is small, each failure generous in what it reveals about constraint. The patience of the deep becomes a model for patience at the bench. The voice lingers, on a single pore somewhere in that honeycomb, wide as a hair, lined with metal sulfide crystals that glint in lamplight from a passing robot. In that pore, warm, alkaline water meets colder ocean across a thin wall. Protons gather and seek passage, carbon molecules search small advantages. An occasional vesicle wedges in a narrow place and divides under shear, then leaves half its content behind and carries the rest onward. Hours pass, then years, then centuries, the chemistry never sleeping, always in flow, mixing new with old, retrying pathways that almost worked, forgetting those that lose to diffusion. What is being tested may be nothing more than endurance, under change, the ability of a network to hold pattern for a heartbeat longer than chance alone would allow. Above the chimney, the water darkens and rises. Below, rock alters and cools. Around, the seafloor receives a dusting of precipitates that record what fed through the labyrinth that day. The notebook of the planet absorbs even this. Minerals settle as faint rings around vent mouths, a decorative seriousness that only later becomes a page. In the far future, uplift may lift such chimneys into air, and rain may polish cross-sections where pores once pulsed, and hands may pass over them without knowing they touch the negative of a long-vanished thought. The listener's breath slows, to match the steady pulse of fluids through rock. The scene holds its quiet despite the energy inside it. No proclamation rises, no verdict falls. The deep simply continues, offering conditions and time, templating curiosity without asking for belief. If Earth is a test field, then perhaps this is one of its most generous corners, a place where matter finds many ways to nearly live, and from nearly, sometimes, learns to live enough to try again. Snow falls like a quiet alphabet, a script of crystals that melt at the edges of their meanings and then freeze again. On high plateaus where wind draws thin lines and sun circles low, this alphabet collects year over year into a pale book. Each winter writes a page with coarse grains and brittle air. Each summer lays a thinner page bright with melt crusts and dust. The field tests a simple proposition. Whether air itself can be kept, whether breath can be bottled by cold, whether the sky's memory can become something the hand may hold. Snow drifts, compacts, and becomes firn, granular, open, still speaking with the atmosphere above. In that open work, air wanders for years, mixing, smoothing spikes into murmurs. With depth, the grains sinter, throats narrow, pathways pinch shut. Close-off arrives not as a line but as a blur in which bubbles become their own rooms, sealed. From the weather outside, the ice begins to keep secrets. Gas ages lag the ice that holds them by years to decades, sometimes centuries in the highest, driest places, so that each core contains 2 clocks. One for the water that fell, one for the air it finally enclosed. The field seems to enjoy such double time, an overlapped lyric that resists hurry. Crystals grow larger as they descend, hexagons knitting into masses that refract light like blue thought. Between them, the bubbles sit, tiny pearls of atmosphere, perfect spheres at first, then slowly becoming ovals as pressure rises, then at great depth transforming into clathrates, gas tucked inside cages of ice, a different sort of keeping. A narrow cylinder lifted from this archive brings the bubbles up again into day, where they hiss their old breath when warmed, as if surprised to find the present waiting. In laboratories cooled to a calm sharpness, that breath decants through glass and into instruments that count atoms. The ratios speak in their small ways. Carbon dioxide remembers the balance of forests and fires. Methane remembers wetlands and ruminants and the hidden hydraulics of permafrost and clathrates. Nitrous. Oxide remembers soils and oceans at work. Their concentrations rise and fall with ice ages and interglacials, breathing in sympathetic rhythm with oceans and deserts. In these traces, the test reads like patience. Can a planet maintain cycles that hold within a range friendly to persistence? Water itself tells temperature. The ice crystal carries oxygen's isotopes, heavy and light, D18O, and hydrogen's, DD, fractions that tilt with the warmth of cloud and pathway of storm. As air cools on its voyage poleward, heavy isotopes drop first, leaving lighter fractions for the long ride inland. Snow that falls in deeper cold bears a lighter signature. Snow that falls in milder times bears heavier ratios. The layers become a thermometer that remembers not a single point, but a system of winds and moisture, a choreography of air masses moving and condensing under subtle rules. The reading is never a simple number. It is a conversation between altitude and latitude, season and storm track, all translated into a slope of isotopes through depth. Volcanoes interrupt with elegant black signatures, sulfate peaks and shards of glass caught between grains. A single explosive season throws ash high into the stratosphere, dusting both poles as a thin, murky smudge that later becomes a pin for time. Some eruptions lower global light for a year or two. Their acids etch the archive with spikes both sharp and sour. Centuries later, an analyst traces these pins through distant cores, ties records together, and the book reveals itself as one volume rather than many. Dust thickens when deserts expand, when winds sharpen across parched continents. In glacial times when seas pull back and shelves dry, fine particles lift and travel and settle into polar snow. Their presence increases the brightness of each winter page, their chemistry testifying to far-off rock types and storm routes. Sea salts lay their own traces, dancing with the strength of polar cyclones, hinting at sea ice edge and open water. In some layers, soot grains rest like small coals. Black carbon that speaks of fire, sometimes forest, sometimes fossil, sometimes both. The cores hold stories that arrive suddenly, like a whisper becoming a knock. In Greenland ice, abrupt warmings, Dansgaard-Oeschger events, rise within decades, perhaps less, bringing shifts in snow chemistry and trapped gas that suggest a reorganization of wind and ocean, a new pathway for heat. In Antarctica, some of these events echo as slower, softer motions, a seesaw across hemispheres written in isotopes and gas age. Younger, driest coolness appears as a crisp return to near glacial values, then a release into the present warmth. The field rehearses thresholds, crosses, recrosses, leaves the traces always just clear enough to show the swiftness with which systemic patience can rearrange itself. Cosmogenic nuclides arrive from space as brief, quiet meteors of information. Beryllium-10 increases when the sun's magnetic breath weakens and cosmic rays enter more easily. It dips when solar wind runs strong. Those variations print into ice layers and offer a second calendar to align with tree rings and sediments. Solar cycles and grand minima become faint barcodes in the white, another metronome braided into the record. In the shallowest chapters, human industry writes handwriting that even the hurried can read. Lead from gasoline climbs in the 20th century and falls after regulations ban it. Sulfate rises with coal and drops with scrubbers. Nitrate hums with fertilizers. Black carbon curves in decades aligned with policy and fire. Tritium from nuclear testing peaks sharply and then fades. Radiocarbon in CO2 surges into the atmosphere as a bomb pulse, then dilutes into the seas and biosphere. A single decade's exhale that travels through archives like a bright thread. The field does not label these lines as blame or praise. It simply preserves their shape as it preserves pine pollen and desert dust. Annual layering holds for a while, snow over snow, a rhythm one could count with a careful eye. Melt seasons lay crusts. Winter storms stack finer grains. Farther down, diffusion softens edges. Grain growth blurs the script. Bubbles migrate slightly before becoming fixed rooms. Counting shifts to chemistry and to pins. Known eruptions. Known solar swings, known shifts in methane that synchronize ice and gas across cores separated by oceans. Even the uncertainties become part of the lesson, that memory always mixes clarity with fog, and that reading requires humility. Camps. Rise briefly over this slow library. Tents bright as petals in the wind, drills purring, cores eased from depth and passed into insulated cases. The field accommodates this attention with its usual indifference and generosity. A cylinder lifted from 2 miles down brings air older than agriculture into daylight. Monitors flicker, a number appears that joins others in a patient curve. The plot is not a verdict, only a poem taking shape point by whispered point, a curve that says the breath quickens here, slows there, lingers, turns. Far below the cold sky, the archive extends through hundreds of thousands of years in Antarctic domes, revealing that glacial rhythms repeat with orbital cycles, eccentricities long sigh, obliquities tilt of seasons, precessions slow, wobble of timing. Greenhouse gases swing with these motions, sometimes leading, sometimes following, always engaged. Dust waxes and wanes, sea ice advances and retreats. The field appears to test resonance, how orbital nudges combine with internal, feedbacks to fold climate in and out of the same familiar shapes. The quiet of this ice suits the question. Trapped bubbles hold not messages but conditions. Their language is chemistry, their meaning borrowed by minds that seek continuity. If Earth is a test field, the cores read like lab notes that time keeps on itself. Not dissertations, not arguments, simply measurements placed gently one after another. The notes remain open to new eyes, new instruments, new harmonies among proxies. What matters most is that the book stays cold enough to keep legible, and that the patience to read does not thin. Even as the surface changes, crevasses opening, sastrugi combed by wind, blue ice polishing where snow ablates, the deep pages keep their tone. Air rests easy in its glass cells, crystals continue their slow annealing, clathrates hold their small cages. Night passes across the plateau with a sound like silence. The archive waits without waiting, an embodiment of calm. The voice lingers there in that measured cool and lets the thought soften. Perhaps the stories the bubbles test and retest are simply these. That breath is a rhythm worth recording, that change can be paced without haste, that memory, when it deepens, becomes gentler. Fire moves through the record like a slow teacher, and sometimes the lesson arrives as a reset. In rock and clay, thin lines hold memories of endings. A seam of darkness, a spike of metals, a hush in the fossil list. The field seems to pause and start again, as if a bell were struck far below hearing and the pulse of life adjusted its rhythm in response. The voice rests with this possibility, not to dramatize but to notice how often the notebook of Earth uses erasure to write a new page. In seabeds where tiny shells rain down, a boundary appears as a narrow band of clay streaked with spherules, and shocked grains, minerals fractured by pressures that ordinary geology seldom applies. Iridium rises above background in that strip, a platinum group metal rare in crust yet common in meteorites. The layer is thin, a breath's width, and yet it speaks of sky gone dark, of dust lifted to a high wind that circles the globe, of photosynthesis stumbling, of food webs stepping down their ladders. Plankton above the line look different. Those below fade, last signatures ending in small spirals and plates. The field does not say impact. It offers a coincidence of signs, metal, glass, fracture, then keeps quiet while the mind makes a story. about a body falling from space and turning day to charcoal noon. Elsewhere, the reset looks like flood basalt, thick stacks of cooled lava spread across a continent by plumbing that reaches from mantle to surface as if a gate briefly opens. Ash and gases enter air not once, but in pulses that repeat for tens to hundreds of thousands of years. Carbon dioxide lifts the greenhouse's hem. Sulfur compounds veil light and acidify rains. Mercury vapor rides winds and later lingers in cores as a memory of volatility. Rivers taste sour. Soils leach. Oceans breathe shorter. The fossil lists record more disappearances than arrivals. The quiet reaches of this archive, carbon isotopes, metal enrichments, step together like a pair of hands meeting in a dim room. In shallow seas, anoxia crawls up from depth. Oxygen thins. Iron turns to pyrite in mud. Laminations replace bioturbation as worms retreat and then vanish. Dark shales grow thick, speckled with the chemistry of breath held too long. When oxygen returns, it arrives slowly, like a dawn through fog. The species that once grazed and sifted do not appear at first. For a while, communities lean small, the Lilliput effect, the tendency for survivors to be diminutive in the immediate aftermath, making a quiet signature in shell sizes and body plans. Later, forms elaborate again, as if conversation resumes after a long pause. 5 times in the long accounting that students learn, the losses stand tall. Late Ordovician cold and sea level fall. Late Devonian drawn-out reconfigurations of reefs and shelves. The great dying at the Permian-Triassic hinge when most species depart, the Triassic-Jurassic reshuffling that opens a window for new reptiles to dominate, the Cretaceous-Paleogene line with its dark clay and absent ammonites. But the planet is less formal than lists suggest. Many other pulses ripple the archive. Oceanic. Anoxic events where black shales spread like quiet fires through time. Regional collapses. Recoveries that take a few million years, or sometimes more. The test, if there is one, seems to concern thresholds and resilience rather than counts. At the foot of a cliff where river gravel rests on older mud, a fern spike appears, pollen grains from hardy plants that colonize disturbance. They surge. In the record, just after the boundary, as if green first returns as simple fronds that love light and ash-rich soil. Trees follow later. Canopies sow themselves slowly. In the interim, landscapes read like open rooms filled with ferns and low, shrubs moving toward shade. The rhythm feels familiar. Fire, then pioneer, then succession. And in this case, the pioneer is global, a botanical signature of reset scaled up. In oceans after dark chapters, tiny calcifiers return as new species. Small at first, then larger, then ornate, relearning the range of forms that chemistry and predation allow. Some lineages never come back. Ammonites end in a flourish of beautiful shells that stop abruptly. Their cousins, nautiloids, continue in a slimmer line. Large marine. Reptiles close their books. Fishes remake the story. Corals shift the balance between builders and algae within their bodies. Reefs rebuild on new foundation stones. The field records not a return to what was, but a drift toward what can be. Given altered currents, altered chemical baselines, altered partnership among organisms. Sometimes cause hides behind a tangle. Volcanism occurs near a boundary. Isotopes swing. An impact layer appears. Species decline in steps rather than a single fall. The mind wishes for clarity. A single agent, a clean line, but the crust is fond of overprinting ink. A flood basalt could prime a system toward fragility. A body from space could tip it. Sea level could ebb or surge in time with both. Feedbacks could carry the rest. The archive resists courtroom logic. It offers weight of evidence, then asks for patience. Reset is not the same as empty. In the shadows that follow, opportunity spreads. Mammals that lived small in the age of great reptiles enlarge their territories and their bodies. Birds explore sky with new forms. Flowering plants move their partnership with pollinators into the wide. Insects redesign mouthparts. Fungi clean. Up. This is not triumph, but filling. Ecological niches are like rooms in a house that occasionally empties. When the door opens again, new tenants arrange the furniture and sometimes the rooms themselves. The field, if testing, may attend to how quickly rooms refill and how differently they look afterward. Clues of fire drift through these passages. Charcoal peaks, soot settling into lakes, black grains in ice. Aside from volcanic smoke, the fires speak of landscape combustion, of forests and grasslands igniting in dry lightning or flares blown from falling debris. After the flame, soils lie bare, then knit. Rains carry sediment in brighter pulses. Deltas jump seaward faster. The colors of the cores shift from pale to pale again as patience returns. Nothing in this moves like punishment. It moves like process, like resonance between fast shocks and slow buffers, between feedbacks and inertia. The question draws close but refuses to sharpen. Do these resets act like a protocol in a field, steps, repeated to test the stability of cycles, or are they only chance compounded by physics? Orbital cycles modulate light by gentle arithmetic. Plate tectonics rearranges land and sea. Mantle plumes erupt without heat of calendars. Biospheres alter their own climate by living. A test, if present, might be indistinguishable from the sum of these rhythms. If absent, the rhythms alone suffice to write what looks like protocol. Perturb, observe, rebound. Perturb harder. Observe a different rebound. The planet behaves as if evaluating its own parameters, not to pass or fail, but to exist. In the Permians, close where loss runs deepest, mercury and carbon signals augment each other. Shallow seas turn sluggish. Coals burn in subsurface fires. Insects decline. Forests retreat. The world narrows to survivors who tolerate stress, who eat broadly, who breathe in cramped chemistries. Recovery takes longer here, the pages above. The boundary thick with sameness before variation returns. It is tempting to read severity as lesson, timescale as grade, but the field offers no rubric, only outcomes. Life persists, learns new arrangements, writes new networks of mutual dependence. All through, the rocks keep their tone, quiet, layered, patient. They note the disappearance of trilobites without lament. They map the return of reefs without applause. They save black shales and greywackies, iridium seams and fern pollen in silts as evenly as they save ordinary sands. The evenness is itself a comfort. It suggests that memory does not amplify drama. It refuses to prioritize noise over signal. It carries all forward because in deep time, any page may become a key. The listener breathes with that evenness. Endings taper into beginnings that do not announce themselves. Innovation sprouts in shaded corners. The edges soften. If Earth is a test field, the resets read like intervals in a composition. A rest. That makes the next phrase audible. A thinning that leaves space for different instruments. Or perhaps there is only the composition, written by physics and chance and feedback, and the ear that hears it chooses to call the rests intentional. Either way, the page turns, and in the turning, the patience of the field feels undisturbed. Dust drifts between worlds the way pollen floats through spring light. It gathers in a soft halo around a planet, glows in the twilight of orbits, threads the dark with faint silver. Comets trail it, asteroids shed it, surfaces beaten by micrometeorites lift it into escape on plumes invisible to ordinary eyes. This slow circulation, the field seems to extend beyond itself, as though a meadow's seed heads whisper to the next valley. If Earth is a test field, the wind that carries trial and chance may be this dust, a thin migration of particles that try every door they can find. Inside some dust, organics nestle. Carbon-rich grains pick up molecules made where starlight is thin and temperature lower than habit allows. Amino acids ride within meteorites that once were rubble heaps. Sugars and bases hide in pores. Long hydrocarbons stretch like unwound threads. Comets keep darker reserves. Ices flavored with methanol. Formaldehyde, hydrogen cyanide. Simple molecules that romance carbon into further complexity when warmed. A tail sparkling against the sun is also a tale of chemistry. The plume lies like a veil across orbits. The veil falls slowly, and the fallen becomes supply. A larger shard tells another version. When a rock strikes a world with enough force, piece after piece lifts into escape. Some fragments hold pockets where heat does not reach, where shock passes around rather than through, where small pores keep safe what they already shelter. In those pockets, desiccated spores, if present, may sleep. Earth ejecta move outward. Mars ejecta move inward. The moon, being undraped by air or ocean, seeds little and catches much. The exchange is not fiction. Stones from Mars land in deserts, and on ice here, bearing gases in their minerals that match Martian air. The journey takes years or thousands. Both are brief on a geologic clock. The door between fields occasionally opens, and dust and stone stroll through. The journey itself acts as test. Vacuum leans long against walls. Ultraviolet chisels at bonds. Cosmic rays throw sharp pebbles of energy into crystalline lattices and polymer backbones. Water leaves. The tiny chemistries of repair go still. Enzymes, if any linger, tighten and sleep. Yet organisms already adapted to dryness on Earth know some version of this pause. Spores pack their DNA in proteins that bind like careful knuckles. Pigments absorb a slice of radiation. Repair resumes when water returns. Under a millimeter of rock, ultraviolet dims. Under a centimeter, it withdraws. Between stone and the void exists a narrow sanctuary where even fragile patterns might carry through a lean stretch of time. Atmospheric entry burns surfaces like matches, but inside hand-sized stones the temperature may rise modestly, a warm evening rather than a fire. Micrometeorites tinier than a grain of sand skip heat by passing their warmth into air fast. They glow and cool and fall like ash. Larger bodies shed their skin, ablate in bright streaks, yet their cores stay calm. A thin shock front at landing crushes and breaks, but not everywhere. Fractures create new rooms and leave old rooms less touched than expected. Even here the field offers gradients. Harsh outside, gentler inside. The test filters by depth. The ocean, when a blessed fragment lands within it, quiets the fall. Waves fold over the stone. Salts seep into cracks. Microbial films climb the walls in minutes, hours, days. If the fragment brings sleepers, warmth and water invite them to see if waking matters. If it brings only chemistry, the water is not offended. It welcomes monomers the way soil welcomes rain, as inputs that local cycles can take or ignore, fold into their ongoing work or leave to dilute. The generosity of water is that it mixes everything and then allows sorting to begin without haste. At the small end of scale, dust alone, no stone needed, might suffice. Radiation pressure can nudge fine grains outward from a star, electromagnetic. Forces can steer them along. Impacts and volcanic plumes launch them above skies. On those motes, the films of life, if life exists on the departing world, might cling for a time. Shielding is thin, yet time is also thin. Adrift from Mars to Earth can be brief, the arc of a soft toss rather than a long sailing. The test again favors plurality of attempts over perfection. Most grains fail, some arrive changed but legible. Very few remain capable of growth. Yet the meadow of space keeps sowing. Evidence for cargo remains shy. Meteorites carry a catalog of organics older than any sea, molecules that predate Earth and therefore cannot be children of its biology. They catalog what chemistry can do in cold and patience, without cells, without enzymes, an exciting poverty. They suggest a head start of ingredients rather than a delivery of recipes or bakers. Experiments in orbit and on mountaintops and in polar nights show that some microbes and tiny animals endure vacuum and punishing radiation if secluded within dust, salt, or rock. Others do not. Survival maps onto habit and shielding. No line here narrows into proof. The lines cross in a mesh that whispers maybe, enough to warrant attention. The idea widens toward other stars. Shock waves from births and deaths of suns stir nearby clouds into long threads, press dust into beads that later become worlds. In those clouds, chemistry runs quietly along icy grains, building organics that later thaw and travel. If a system makes many planets, the early years likely include heavy weather, bombardment, plumbing opened, surfaces churned. In the churn, fragments leap from one newborn field to another, taking with them what they carry. If life starts anywhere, within that family, its younger siblings might receive messengers. The test then reads like a control series, parallel runs differing only by circumstance. There is a delicate comfort in this image, not a universe crowded with invasions, but one mild with exchange. Stars cannot write letters to each other, not easily, but their planets can trade dust and stone within families, and their families can brush sleeves in the slow dance that lasts for billions of years. The distances between systems are still severe. Most seeds fall within a single household, but the household itself is broad. A star's domain is large enough to be its own garden, full of sheltered corners and gentle microclimates on a planetary scale. Directed sowing sits at the far edge of the thought, a civilization choosing to. Seed clouds or comets with hardy chemistry, aiming for resilience, not conquest. The voice visits this edge without lingering. Intention is not required for distribution to work. Wind does not need plan. Rivers do not intend deltas. Yet if minds rise in some fields, perhaps patience shifts toward stewardship. Perhaps they sweeten the dust with small kindnesses, a more even chance for beginnings where conditions nearly suffice. Skepticism remains as a kind companion. The origin of life can be local. Ponds and clays and vents do not need gifts older than their skies. Seed arrival solves one question by moving it elsewhere. If life rides stones to earth, it must arise somewhere first, and that somewhere needs conditions not unlike those the field already offers. The distribution system, then, may be less about outsourcing origin and more about redundancy, a way for cycles to preserve their fragile experiments across shocks, to keep possibility distributed rather than concentrated, so that failure in one place does not mean silence everywhere. The image settles. Dust drifting in the zodiacal light, a river of faint gold seen just after sunset by those who look from dry, high places. Comets returning with long, patient periods. Meteors stitching brief silver threads across the dark. Micrometeorites raining unseen, resting on roofs, sinking into snow, nestling in ice and ocean. The field breathes through this exchange, slow and unafraid. Seeds attempt every soil. Soils accept every seed and say, "Without words, we will see." In this quiet, the question returns softer than before. If spores ride comets and dust, if fragments move between worlds like letters between distant kin, does the experiment broaden its heart? Perhaps the test, if test exists, is simply to see whether life continues when scattered, whether patience increases when shared, whether beginnings multiply when no single beginning is asked to carry everything. The corridor between worlds stays dim, without signposts, an aisle lit by the slow glitter of small things in motion. The voice lets that glitter fade to darkness and waits, unhurried, for whatever the dust decides. Between stars, the silence does not feel empty. It feels like a room where breath is held, where meanings wait inside light. A planet turns and throws a faint signature into that room, a mix of glows and shadows that says only this is how matter arranges itself here. If Earth is a test field, perhaps it also becomes a beacon without trying, the way a forest becomes a scent. The voice rests on this thought like a hand on warm stone, and asks what signals might be legible to anyone who looks with patience rather than urgency. Daylight reflecting from leaves carries an edge, a sudden rise in brightness near the red, chlorophyll's gentle confession. In spectra, the red edge sharpens like a leaf's own breath, a leap from absorption to reflection where pigments stop drinking light and start scattering it back. Clouds soften the mark, seasons modulate it. Continents turning let it strobe slowly in a patient rhythm. Far away, a watcher could look for that steepness and wonder whether rocks ever make such a cliff in color on their own, whether minerals alone can mimic the tone of life. Some do, under certain skies, some cannot. The pattern would need context, gases in the air, the star's hue, the way oceans deepen blue. Air itself becomes message. A cloak rich in oxygen yet salted with methane hints at a tension that chemistry alone rarely holds for long. Ozone joins the conversation as a thin, high veil. Carbon dioxide shapes the greenhouse. Nitrous oxide adds a low note. If these coexist, a watcher might read disequilibrium, too much appetite for one another to persist without constant living work. But even there, patience advises caution. Some stars split water with harsh light and let hydrogen escape, leaving oxygen behind, without a leaf ever folding. Some rocks yield gases that confuse the tale. The field seems to test the reader as much as the writer. Interpretation must move slowly, circling possibilities like a waiter feeling for stable ground. Light passing through air during transits carries fingerprints, thin shadows of molecules absorbed against a star's face. Light bouncing off a crescent carries a different alphabet, glint from oceans at certain angles, polarization that water favors, a glimmer that shifts as waves roughen, phase curves, brightness waxing and waning with rotation, whisper of clouds and continents, of storms that march and fade. With time, a map might emerge from nothing but the timing of gleams. Not an atlas of edges and place names, but a mood board of surfaces, pale belts and dark caps, a flicker that hints at a surface that remembers rain. At night, cities draw constellations on ground, a temporary sky under the real one. Their light is efficient, narrow, often tuned to bands that biology does not need. Could anyone far away see that lace? Distance makes it hard. The planet's own reflected daylight overwhelms the night. The day-night average dilutes the pattern. Energy totals blend into thermal glow. Yet the idea remains. Artificial light may carry telltale spectra or relentless regularity, a flicker that does not track clouds, a winter bright where latitudes should be dark. The voice does not promise detectability. It savors the thought of a signature that is less shout than hum. Waste heat is less shy. Every engine sheds it. Every computation spills it like faint warmth into the dark. Life does too, but technology concentrates the spill. If a civilization grows extravagant, its planet might glow slightly more in the mid-infrared than geology and sunlight alone predict. Dust can fake that glow. Youth and debris often do. But a mismatch between the color of starlight and the color of planetary warmth, persistent and global, could raise an eyebrow at a distance. Farther along the path of speculation, structures built to drink starlight might reroute energy from visible into infrared, a star wearing an artificial chill. Yet galaxies make such disguises naturally with dust. The sky enjoys ambiguity. Signals remain questions, not pronouncements. Radio slips through gas with a particular grace. Narrow-band tones, more precise than any known natural masser, could comb the spectrum like taut threads. A watcher listens near the hydrogen line because universes love that frequency. A watcher listens near hydroxyl because water is a friend to life. A watcher listens where the sky is quiet. Drifts in frequency reveal motion. Dispersion hints at distance. Silence returns more often than song. Quiet is data, too. It suggests either that transmitters do not spend their energy on strangers, or that the room is larger than thought and voices travel poorly through it. The voice feels no impatience with this. It knows that a test field need not publish results loudly to be real. Laser pulses dream at the edge of hearing. Short, bright, and rare, they could jump across light years like thrown glints. A technology might choose them for greetings because they pin a moment tightly and waste little. Yet dust and distance blur even brevity. The field at home does not decide how others announce themselves. It simply keeps its own suite of signals running. Green edges in leaves, gases arguing in air, warmth held and released, thunderheads painting, days with moving shadows. Biosignatures blur into technosignatures when chemistry grows deliberate. A chlorophyll edge might eventually be joined by compounds unlikely to be made in bulk by volcanoes or microbes, halogenated gases with no natural suppliers, long-lived and spectral, thin but distinct. Yet even here, caution persists. Strange. Planets might make strange chemicals without intention. Ice and light might conspire to forge molecules that look like artifacts from the vantage of a different chemistry. The field invites kindness toward uncertainty. The geometry of observation matters. A planet bathed in steady light from a yellow star tells one story. The same planet hugging a red dwarf endures flares that beat against molecules and winds that strip. Tidal locking might fix day and night in place. Air could circulate as a single, giant lung. Clouds might wall the terminator. Spectra would change accordingly. Signals would drift with weather as grand as continents. Interpretation must step lightly, aware that Earth-tuned expectations bend the eye. A test field teaches the reader to unlearn before it learns again. Silence in the record, no methane, no oxygen, a calm veil of nitrogen and carbon dioxide, does not read as failure. It reads as youth or pause, as a field lying fallow, as chemistry setting the table for later guests. The temptation to fill that silence with sentinels watching from afar can be honored without indulging certainty. If others watch, perhaps they prefer to weigh patience rather than amplitude, looking not for shouts but for the ability of cycles to continue. If no one watches, the signals still matter. They feed the local feedbacks that keep rain returning and frost thawing and light weaving into sugars. The planet listens to itself, even if no one else does. Tools on this world learn to listen more gently. Mirrors broaden. Interferometers tease apart light that used to blur. Coronagraphs shape darkness around a point so that faint neighbors can be seen. Clocks refine drift so that time itself becomes a filter. Patience pages through Spectra 1, faint line at a time. Data sets lengthen until rhythms appear. Seasons, storms, rotation, the slow swing of tilt. From these, sketches emerge. Crude continents, suggested oceans, conjectured storms. The giver of signals does not change because a receiver exists. The receiver changes by learning to read. The voice returns to Earth as writer and reader. The planet announces itself constantly, in a daily blink of white from cloud, in a slow wink from land, in the blue-black purr of oceans seen at a slant, in the bright knife of ice, in air whose ingredients quarrel and reconcile. Night lights spark and fade, but the sure signals are older than cities. The red edge of leaves, the impossible partnership of gases, the warmth that matches a distance consistent with liquid water. If a test field has a metric, it may be the subtlety of these overlapping signs, the coherency of a symphony with many instruments, none soloing for long. The room of silence remains as it was, vast, calm, softly resonant. Signals cross it like dust motes catching sun in a dark house. Some are natural and tender, some, perhaps, are deliberate but restrained. Most are not aimed at anyone. The listener drowses with this, reassured by the idea that meaning often arrives in layers and that the quiet between them is part of the message. Whether anyone watches, the field keeps writing, and the writing, the patient light leaking from atmosphere and ocean, from leaf and cloud, seems content to be its own reply. The planet floats like a dark aquarium lit from one side, a bowl that glimmers where dawn slides and dims where night gathers. A biosphere swims beneath a lid of thin light. The glass, the air, is nearly nothing compared to the water and stone below, and yet it is enough to hold heat and color and scent, enough to make the whole vessel appear alive from a patient distance. The voice moves slowly around this image, as if walking the perimeter of a tide pool at low tide, letting eyes adjust to ripples and shadow until small motions become visible. Near the surface, light enters the ocean and spends itself within a few hundred meters, the euphotic skin where photosynthesis keeps the rhythm of day. Phytoplankton bloom when conditions meet. Iron, light, calm, spreading green swirls that satellites can see the way one sees a faint clouded breath on glass. Zooplankton graze by night and hide by day, and fishes follow them in blue columns that rise and sink with the turning of Earth. This daily migration, the largest in number of bodies anywhere, reads like respiration at a planetary scale. A slow inhalation toward the surface after sunset. A steady exhalation toward depth when dawn arrives. Far below, beyond reach of solar grammar, bioluminescent syllables flicker, brief and articulate, words in an alphabet the air cannot carry. On land, light skim-coats forests, then sinks by layers, canopy, understory, leaf litter, soil. Each stratum invents its own economy. Stomata open, sugars knit, fungi unspool filaments that creep into wood and stone with a patience that rivals. Rivers. In deserts, the light scours and bleaches. Life answers by withdrawing, waiting within crusts, seeds, and burrows, then rushing out in brief, bright weather. The aquarium's interior changes slowly compared to thought, but swiftly compared to stone. A pace that invites watchers to kneel and look longer, to let attention ripen. If observation happens, perhaps it resembles the kneeling. Perhaps a reader stands outside the glass and leans, not to tap, only to attend. From orbit, instruments already play this role. Sensors taste wavelengths scattered from leaves, read chlorophyll as a green edge and as a ratio that shifts with stress. Ocean color maps paint spirals where eddies lift nutrients to light. Infrared panels feel the exhale of warm reservoirs at dusk, the cool inhale of forests after rain. Radar traces roughness on a stormed sea. The aquarium announces its moods through patterns more than events, through recurring shapes that drift and return, the way a tide pool remakes itself every 6 hours and yet remains itself. Inside, currents. Stitch water masses together with threads of temperature and salt. Mesoscale eddies roll like slow coins. Fronts sharpen like the boundaries between glass panes. Upwelling shoals nutrients at coasts and sends chains of life across seasons. At depth, oxygen thins in patient bands where respiration exceeds supply, then thickens again where currents mend the deficit. The living film feels this as a texture, zones of relief and constraint that shift like the lights in a room. In soils, oxygen fades with depth too, handing the work to microbes that breathe nitrogen and sulfur, writing faint metallic notes into groundwater. The aquarium is not uniform. It is a patchwork, and its patchwork makes room for the improbable to continue. Tides pass a hand over everything. The moon draws and loosens, turning coasts into experiments repeated twice a day for eons. Salt marshes breathe in, mudflats shine, mangroves lift and lower their roots like fingers that knit the air to the sea. In tide pools, algae float and settle. Fish hover and dart. From a cliff, a watcher sees only foam and dark rock. Kneeling, the watcher sees anemone, snail, the strobed unspooling of a limpet's foot. From one star to another, perhaps planets appear likewise, first as disks of color, then with patience as laced and alive surfaces. Across ice, the aquarium becomes a pale lantern. Brine channels open within frozen sheets, corrode geometry into honeycomb, shelter algae that tint the base with a ghostly green. Underfoot, the living film continues thin and steady where darkness should rule. At the shelf edge, polynyas steam in winter, windows of black water where winds pull ice aside and the ocean exhales. Seals and whales take these windows the way one takes a breath between long silences. The thin light urges a global migration that never finishes. Birds tracing coasts between hemispheres, fishes following isotherms, insects riding pressure gradients like braided roads. The whole tank seems to stir with slow drifts that do not ask where and why. They ask only whether there is a corridor. In the glass itself, the air, signals fold outward. Oxygen and methane hold their contrary positions. Nitrous oxide hums, low. Water vapor fills and empties. Cloud decks assemble like schools of pale fish and disperse with similar mindlessness. On some days, a cloud slips into a wave shape, the air remembering that it is a fluid. On others, streets of cumulus draw, parallel lines to a vanishing point beyond the horizon. The lid is never still, and its never stillness filters light so that interiors know the difference between morning and afternoon, between drought and relief, between a day of hunting and a day of waiting. If watched from outside, these filters reveal themselves as steady seasonal tilts, as flickers of storm, as persistent belts of quiet. Cities add a thin new layer, a lace on the glass. At night they glow in a spectrum that chlorophyll does not require. By day they alter the texture of convection and rain. Their heat islands look like small scars and also like steady beacons. Their aerosols seed clouds and dim sunlight in modest, complicated ways. Yet the aquarium absorbs them. Their rivers still obey gravity and meander. Their fields still answer to soil and sky. Their boundaries blur as vines climb and lichens gild stone. The biosphere remains a swimmer through them, not a prisoner of them. The notion of being watched lingers without sharpening into audience. A tide pool does not change because eyes arrive. It changes because the sun and moon and air insist. Should you attention rest upon it, the pool offers what it already is. So, perhaps, with Earth. If observed, the offering remains this: cycles that close more often than they break, feedbacks that soften sharpness, thresholds that appear and recede. If unobserved, the offering is the same. The test, if any, could be whether these properties sustain under novelty, whether small shocks fade and larger ones redraw but do not erase. Instruments drift within the water column without need for watchers beyond. Floats rise and fall on schedules, reading temperature, salinity, oxygen, pH. Drifters follow surface currents, writing calligraphy of motion. Gliders fly slowly along isopycnals, unhurried arrows in a dense, invisible air. Their traces become a new way to read the tank from inside, to compare the way light looks to leaves with the way warmth feels to deep water. Observation becomes part of the aquarium's own metabolism, a feedback that learns and occasionally changes behavior, the way wolves re-entering a valley alter rivers by altering deer. The line between watcher and watched grows moss and disappears. All the while, an ordinary day proceeds. Sunlight reaches through atmosphere and across waves. Plankton answer. Grazers rise. Predators follow. Fecal snow falls. Bacteria dine and recycle. Nutrients rest and then return. Over forests, stomata close for noon and reopen in evening cool. Over deserts, heat sculpts wind into arabesques that the next day erases. At the coast, a child kneels and watches a pool. In that gaze, time slows enough for shrimp to become visible. The aquarium, it seems, teaches attention by being what it is. Silence returns to the room around this image. Perhaps a listener outside the glass waits for rare disruptions. Global blooms, odd gases, light that pulses with unfamiliar regularity. Perhaps the listener waits for nothing at all and drifts past. Either way, the biosphere keeps its even breath. Thin light arrives, is sorted, turns into sugar and motion and heat, and leaves altered but legible. The field swims under it, aware or not, and the swimming is its testimony, that such rhythms can hold for a while, that complexity can remain soft, that boundaries can be membranes rather than walls. The voice lingers, then lets the image dim, as a tide pool does when evening takes the last high color from water and hands it back to sky. Time leans without force, and yet everything moves. The planet tilts a little more, then a little less. Its path around the star stretches toward an ellipse, then rounds again. The axis wobbles like a slow top. None of this is dramatic, none explosive, and still the biosphere answers. If Earth is a test field, the pressure applied here is soft. So soft it feels like weather that takes millennia, and evolution reads it like a tide, not a command. Snowlines wander with these orbital moods. Summers strengthen or weaken depending on tilt. Winters shift their emphasis depending on the wobble that points solstices toward or away from perihelion. The overall warmth breathes with how far the path deviates from a circle. Ice grows, then sighs back. Sea level lowers, then rises. Shelves bare their bones and then drown them in sand. Shallow seas advance and retreat across continents, creating nurseries one epoch and deserts the next. In each slow pulse, barriers appear and dissolve. Populations that once mixed now split. Those that once stood apart now mingle. Genetic drift thickens in isolation. Selection wanders down new alleys when climates rearrange where food and shelter lie. Speciation and reunion follow the patient metronome of tilt and orbit. The way tide pools fill and empty under a moon that never tires. Forests migrate without walking. Their seeds ride wind and birds, creeping poleward when summers lengthen, retreating when cold insists. Grasses surge into the gaps, offering graze and fire in place of shade. Teeth change shape, hooves harden, guts enlist new partners among. Microbes. Along coastlines, mangroves step into drowned river mouths. When the water falls again, salt flats seed hardy shrubs that teach salinity to bend. The field does not ask whether these shifts are tests. It only supplies rhythms that keep base conditions from hardening into singularity. In caves and deep lake muds, thin layers of calcite and clay remember season, wet and dry, with a fidelity that would embarrass clocks if clocks had pride. Their regularity hums alongside living regularities, salmon returning, cicadas rising, corals building daily and lunar bands into their skeletons like slow beads. The moon's nod, a cycle of tide that strengthens and weakens every 18 years, writes faintly in marsh edges and river mouths, and creatures tuned to it with instincts that read pressure and light. Even the length of the day is not fixed. Tidal. Friction hands a little energy to heat and pulls a little from rotation, and so the day stretches over ages. Ancient corals keep count in growth lines, more days per year in far time, fewer now, and the tally suggests a biosphere that rehearses, timing across eons, always slightly retuning. Radiation arrives, gentle most days, fierce on a few, modulated by the star's breath and the planet's shield. When the star's wind relaxes, cosmic rays slip through more easily. When the magnetic field weakens or wanders, penetration deepens. Moons and secondaries pass through bodies like fine rain, breaking strands and making small errors the repair crews then correct, mostly. Mutation is inevitable even without the sky's help, but sky contributes, a little variance to the variance. The pressure is not a shove but a suggestion, a background noise that sometimes gets louder, bringing small bursts of novelty that selection can sift. If the field were intentional, which it likely is not, it would not need to design features. It would only need to vary the noise and allow feedbacks to decide what persists. Mountains lift and lean beneath the same long tempos. As plates ram and override, rivers cut new routes, rain shadows birth deserts, moist winds concentrate green on one side and ochre on the other. Corridors for migration open where ridges lower. Walls rise where valleys narrow. The slow tilt of a plateau is enough to turn one basin toward another ocean, to rearrange drainage and send fish and floodplain forests into unexpected company. At the edges of glaciers, fresh soils gleam, raw, rock flower bright, mineral rich, and pioneers. Arrive with tools honed by earlier retreats, lichens, mosses, nitrogen-fixing shrubs. When ice returns, they withdraw like careful breath. Evolution takes these alternations as invitations to try again with slight edits. Ocean circulation answers to wind and salt and heat in patterns both stubborn and delicate. A freshening. Where ice melts can slow a conveyor in one basin. An opening seaway can stitch together two that were once strangers. Plankton communities reorganize where upwelling strengthens or fails. The shells they make carry chemistry that laments or celebrates the change. Predators follow fronts like invisible fences, and their migrations, stretched over centuries by currents and climate, test whether instinct can keep pace with drift. Somewhere in these long experiments, a lineage invents antifreeze proteins. Elsewhere, another grows the patience to starve without dying. Elsewhere, a flower tweaks its pigments to court a pollinator whose season advances by a week every few hundred years. The planet's magnetic field flips from time to time, a polarity reversal that leaves stripes in basalt and alters where aurora is speak. The flip itself is not a catastrophe in living terms. Compasses lose their minds. Maps based on magnetism become puzzles. Cosmic rays likely push a little deeper for a while. Perhaps this adds a hint of change to mutation's palette. Perhaps it adds only a footnote. The aquarium absorbs it, as it absorbs so many modulations that, experienced locally, feel like weather, but, seen in the aggregate, feel like posture. Controversies drift through the study of these pressures like high cirrus. Do cosmic rays seed? Clouds. Do solar cycles shift rain far from the obvious? Are the rhythms in extinctions real or artifacts of an uneven fossil record? How strongly do orbital cycles steer evolution versus ecology? The patient answer tends to be both and neither. Climate moves habitability. Habitability moves opportunity. Opportunity moves selection. Selection writes in genes. Genes remember environment imperfectly and then pass the imperfect memory forward. The field works by invitation, not by decree. It says here is a new shoreline, here is a corridor, here is a plateau of wind. Now see what lives can do with that. even. Within bodies, soft pressure applies. Day length filters through circadian clocks, tuning hormones and wakefulness. Lunar light, even faint, touches spawning in reef fish and corals. The calendar of tides lives in nervous systems that have never learned a word. Epigenetic marks flicker with seasons and diet, sometimes persisting long enough to look like memory beyond sequence. Development itself, the choreography from egg to form, responds to temperature and timing in ways subtle enough to build diversity from the same toolkit. These are nudges, not scripts. The field nudges. Lineages answer at different speeds. Times. Pressure also acts by removing insistence. Stability stretches long enough for coevolution to braid partners together. Flowers and bees tune color and scent. Mycorrhizal fungi and trees exchange sugars and phosphorus like old friends. Reef-building corals and algae negotiate light and nutrient in arrangements that hold until heat unthreads them. These mutualisms do not require outside approval. They arise because intervals of gentle change allow bargains to compound into structure. Where change accelerates, the braids loosen. Where it slows, the cords strengthen. Where it oscillates, an intermediate rope remains, flexible enough to bend. The voice notices a kinship between these nudges and the kind of science that reads them. Neither storms the question. Both circle it, adding faint lines until the figure appears. Milankovitch cycles, cosmic weather, plate breath, magnetic wander, all are pencils on paper sketching a deer by many strokes. The drawing is never finished, and yet it is recognizable enough to evoke motion. Nothing in this implies design shaped like will. The planet's rhythms arise from geometry and mass, from friction and fluid, from the memory of a collision that gave the world its moon and of a core that spins and boils. Yet the biosphere behaves as if adaptive minds were receiving assignments from a kindly tutor. Adjust leaf when light changes. Adjust walk when plane becomes slope. Adjust sleep when day lengthens. Adjust shell when carbonate chemistry shifts. The tutor is imaginary. The student is not. Evolution hears the homework through survival, and survival grades the work with offspring. Across the field, today and always, the soft pressure continues. Beaches move landward grain by grain. Desert margins pulse with rain's fickle loyalty. Boreal forests sway where permafrost softens. Kelp forests waver where currents warm. Genes shuffle and select, making small bets in every generation. Some bets persist until the next ice age. Some only until the next drought. Some long enough to found a new shape of wing or a new way of digesting grass. Time applies without cruelty, without hurry, and still the ledger fills with responses, trimmed by chance and kept by memory. The thought rests lightly. Perhaps what looks like nudge from outside is simply the planet being itself, and the true test, if there is one, lies in whether life can remain conversational with that selfhood. To remain conversational is to stay sensitive to faint pressures, to keep clocks adjustable, to let diversity spread risk the way an estuary spreads tide. The aquarium learns this by doing. The record keeps the traces of the learning, shells, that thicken when predators sharpen, leaves that alter pores as air thins, bones that elongate when grasslands open. Time's soft hand leaves fingerprints everywhere. The hand is only physics. The fingerprints are biographies. Night stretches. The metronomes keep time. Tilt continues its slow bow. The axis turns like a page. The star breathes in a cycle older than calendars. The field answers with migrations, buds, dormancies, eggs. Nothing concludes. The pressure remains gentle and persistent, and in that persistence, the biosphere composes itself again. Carbon counts without speaking. It moves through leaves and lungs, into shells and back to air, through roots and rivers, and at each handoff. Its isotopes lean subtly this way or that. The arithmetic runs on ratios, on tiny preferences that atoms keep the way a tide keeps time. In this field, the bookkeeping is elegant, a little less of the heavy, a little more of the light, and the difference becomes a diary. If Earth is a test field, carbon's tally may be the most patient record keeper, a clerk that never tires, a mindless mind for whom every transfer is a mark. Sunlight starts the ledger in green. During photosynthesis, enzymes favor the lighter, carbon, 12C, because lighter moves with slightly more ease. Sugars inherit this preference. Leaves wear it like a faint signature in their fibers. The atmosphere in turn leans a little heavier because what remains after preference is counted, shifts in that direction. Tree rings file these numbers year by year. Cool summers in one band, warm in another, droughts in the narrowing of space between. Marsh grasses and wheat, maize and millet choose different metabolic doors, C3, C4, and their choices adjust. The arithmetic by a few per mille, like dialects of the same language. Bones of grazers and skulls lifted from midden heaps remember those choices. The diets of herds and households show themselves in the breath of their carbon, a quiet census, of how landscapes learn agriculture and how bodies follow. In the sea, shells speak in carbonate, and their D13C tells a slightly different story, one about the dissolved carbon pool and its exchanges with air and with sinking rain of organic matter. Where life blooms and exports carbon to depth, surface waters grow a little heavier. Where upwelling lifts old, respired carbon, the surface leans light. Foraminifera collect that tilt as they build their chambers, each test a micro-accounting of food and breath. Laid into mud and pressed into stone, these tests stack columns of numbers that later become curves, glacial rhythms in the slow rise and fall of D13C, long swings that match the balance between burial and weathering, quick flutters that hint at eddies and monsoons not otherwise named. Methane keeps its own accent. Microbes in wetlands and guts give it a very light signature. Carbon dioxide reduced in the warmth of subsurface rocks wears a heavier one. In clathrates, these hues of carbon sleep in cages that ice makes at depth. When released, they lighten. The air briefly, small size in reeds, sometimes larger in abrupt changes whose traces spread through cores and carbonates as negative bends in the line. Volcanic breath, by contrast, speaks closer to mantle values, modestly heavy, a different parentage entering the conversation. The archive enjoys such differences. They allow triangulation by tone rather than by volume. Across deep time, excursions appear, sudden drops or rises that return slowly toward the old baseline. A rapid warming riffling through ocean and land prints a broad, lightward swing in D13C across many basins. Recovery arrives as burial and weathering negotiate a new calm. Black shales thicken where oxygen thins. Organic carbon is sequestered, and the atmosphere leans back toward heavier values as the light fraction retires to stone. The arithmetic looks like conscience, but is only chemistry, a system adjusting its ledgers when too much is spent from one account. The field favors cycles that close, even after a lurch. On the time scales of a breath, the ledger is intimate. A lake records a summer bloom in plankton organic matter and a winter of calmer sediment, the two stacked like heartbeats. A cave drape. In thin calcite, Ring speaks of rainy years and dry. Its carbon toggles between soil breath and bedrock dissolution. Peat blankets a valley. Its D13C leans with the balance of moss and sedge and the height of water table. In each, the pattern is not verdict but presence, a proof that living and mineral exchanges remain conversational. Then the arithmetic receives a new kind of nudge. Fuels drawn from deep time. Old sunlight long kept in black seams and porous. Stone. Return quickly to air. Their carbon carries very little 40.C, that gentle clock of cosmic ray origin, because enough half-lives have passed to fade it almost to silence. Their D13C is also light, the breath of ancient photosynthesis. Ghost leaf. Mixed into the present breath, this lightness pulls the atmosphere's ratio downward decade by decade, a quiet slope that tree rings and air trapped in ice easily keep. The ledger notes the change without judgment. Winds distribute it. Oceans. Drink and answer. Their surface waters leaning lighter and passing that signal into the shells of the day. Later, the ocean's depth receives the same suggestion as currents carry the new arithmetic downward, a slow, global diffusion of a single, coherent thought. Elsewhere, a brief, bright addition appears when atoms split in tests that flash the sky. T14E surges worldwide, a pulse that then disperses into sea and land, a date stamp that spreads into tissues and sediments and then fades according to its own soft calendar. The pulse is short enough to act like a pin in many records. It is one of the cleanest lines a reader can find, a thin, bright stitch crossing archives otherwise written in gradual pens. The field accommodates even this with its usual poise, tucking the moment into peat and coral and wood as if to say yes. Noted, and now we continue. The word intelligence drifts through this accounting not as an accusation, but as a question. Does the ledger record thought? Perhaps only as pattern. Selection of crops that favor C4 pathways stitches a change through soils and bones on a continent. The domesticating of herds shifts isotopic averages in villages and steppes. Cities burning buried sunlight lean the air lighter with a speed that surprises tree rings. Fisheries alter food webs and the signatures of carbon in predator tissues. Cement turns limestone back into gas and writes a small echo into rivers and reefs. None of these are messages in letters. They are sums of choices embodied in chemistry, markers that any later reader can weigh without knowing the words that accompanied the acts. Arithmetic becomes most eloquent when lines agree. The fall of D13C in air matches a similar fall in surface ocean dissolved carbon. Tree cellulose chirps the same decline. The carbonate shells of living foraminifera sing it back in marine tongues. Stalagmites nod from caves. The robustness of the chord says less about cause than about connectedness. Air and water and stone exchanging quickly enough that a nudge travels everywhere. The ledger delights in such coherence because it reduces the need for inference. The curve itself suffices as a story of speed and reach. In the deep register, the carbon cycle carries a thermostat shaped by rock. Silicate weathering takes carbon. Dioxide makes bicarbonate, carries it to sea, and locks it as carbonate. Metamorphism and volcanoes later release it. The D13C difference between organic burial, light, and carbonate burial, closer to air, informs the long average of the atmosphere. Over tens of millions of years, the curve wanders within a lane that sediments and volcanoes together define. The tally shows that the field learns stability by feedback, not by stasis. The ledger does not freeze, it compensates. Animals keep miniature ledgers too. Tooth enamel stores the balance of C3 and C4 plants in the food chain. The ratio changes. As grasslands expand or maize enters diets, as herds move into new plains or gardens spread along rivers. Shellfish grow in rings. Their carbon remembers estuaries breathing with tides and seasons, remembers urban watersheds and their altered carbon, remembers past salinities. Even soot and tar hold isotopic echoes of what burned, the signature of old peat versus young, wood of oil versus prairie. Intelligence here looks like tool and fire, road and field, but the record that keeps it is still only ratio, still only a lean toward light or heavy that later minds interpret. Skepticism sits comfortably in this room. Volcanoes can push D13C, clathrates can sigh, basins can stratify and cough up light carbon, weathering can quicken. Signals overlay. Context carries much of the meaning. A reader combines curves with metal concentrations, with leaf pores. In fossils, with temperatures suggested by other isotopes. The arithmetic remains simple. The reading is what grows complex. Perhaps this is also part of the test, whether a mind can let uncomplicated numbers stay uncomplicated while building a gentle architecture of inference around them. Night holds steady as numbers glide through images. A line slopes downward in a plot pinned to a laboratory wall. Outside the building, trees make new rings. Far offshore, foraminifera fall through moonlit water and take their positions in the column. In caves, a drip counts seconds into millennia. The clerk does not sleep. Carbon keeps its accounts in all these places at once, and the accounts reconcile because the field, however loud its moments, prefers continuity. Whether this arithmetic records intelligence depends on how one defines the word. If intelligence means the capacity of cycles to hear themselves and adjust, then yes, the record over deep time shows many instances. If intelligence means planning and reflection, then the ledger registers not thoughts but consequences, shifts in diet, energy, and stone that happen to leave numbers behind. The question rests as gently as a leaf on water. The numbers are there, soft as breath on glass, and any reader can look and see their slope. The field accepts being read or not. It continues its counting either way. The question takes off its shoes and enters softly. If a great filter exists, does it whisper rather than shout? And does Earth sit somewhere along it like a checkpoint and a sanctuary at once? The thought does not ask for verdicts. It asks how thresholds feel from inside a world, how they pass like seasons that last millions of years. The voice lingers where thresholds gather, origins, leaps, and long survivals, and lets each one breathe. A first threshold feels like spark without flame. Chemistry becomes heredity, and heredity becomes error that selection can sculpt, mistakes that improve their chances by being copied. In vents and pools, in films on rock and droplets, in tide flats, the system tries many ladders. Most ladders collapse. A few hold. One persists long enough to braid metabolism with membrane and code. From far away, the step looks singular. From inside the field, it feels distributed. A cloud of attempts drifting for ages until a self-maintaining circuit steadies. A second threshold resembles merger rather than invention. Cells that once lived as simpler selves join. Endosymbiosis turning ingestion into partnership. A lineage learns to keep an energetic furnace within, mitochondria multiplying ATP like small hearths, and another keeps sunlight makers that turn photons into sugar. The leap is not inevitable. It happens and then, for a long while, it does not happen again. The field holds this rarity without explaining it. Perhaps chance matters. Perhaps habitability windows must widen before such intimacy can last. Oxygen gathers, then falters, then gathers more. Atmosphere becomes not just blanket but permission. For big bodies, busy metabolisms, the play of nerves and muscle, the risk of fire. Before that, oxygen scrapes and irritates, a toxin to earlier. Chemistries that learn to hide or detoxify. The planet negotiates with this reactive gas until a compromise becomes climate and habit. Here the filter feels like patience. Can cycles arrange themselves so that oxidative power fuels variety without burning it away? Multicellularity arrives many times. Nervous systems with depth arrive fewer. Skeletons that hinge and eyes that image fewer still. Language that recruits breath into abstraction perhaps only once here. Each step reads as a steepening slope rather than a cliff. Gradual elaborations interleaved with sudden affordances. Snowball freezes force refuges. Post-freeze seas offer new mineral rations. Developmental toolkits learn to reuse the same genes, to pattern limbs and segments. The field provides stage and props. Lineages decide whether a rehearsal becomes a play. Planets themselves filter by quiet criteria. Continents wander and redraw nurseries. Tides keep time. A large moon steadies tilt so that seasons remain teachable. Plate tectonics operates like thermostat and recycling service. A magnetic field keeps air familiar. Water lingers liquid in broad belts. These are thresholds not as events, but as conditions. A world that keeps too much heat convects its crust into restless youth. A smaller world freezes its heart and loses its shield. A closer world tidally locks and stares with one face into a flare-prone star. Earth sits in a region that permits ambling, not sprinting, enough push to change, enough cushion to remember. Intelligence, if defined as the capacity to notice pattern and adjust behavior, appears in many branches. Octopuses test lids. Corvids bend wire into hooks. Elephants remember water maps. Wolves teach. Whales choreograph. But technological adolescence, the short span when a lineage can alter planetary systems before it learns restraint, may be the narrowest door. Fire, tools, language, agriculture, industry, radio, each arrives faster than evolutionary buffers can grow. The filter here may be a lesson in tempo. Can cultural speed learn to match biospheric patience? Can appetite learn cadence? Detection adds its own sieve. Signals that cross the dark require not just making, but maintaining. A civilization might whisper for centuries and then grow quiet by choice, by distraction, by reorientation toward media that leak less into space. Waste. Heat hides inside efficiency. Beacons yield to fiber and whisper to quantum. Monuments return to soil. Silence that worries listeners may be a sanctuary's hush rather than a graveyard's. In a test field, the metric might not be amplitude but longevity. Can a conversation with a planet last long enough to be overheard by neighbors who are also busy listening inward? Risks feel smaller up close and larger in the book. Asteroids visit rarely, yet their marks are clean. More common are the subtle risks. Soils thinned by haste, waters that lose breath, feedbacks that amplify novelty into noise. The field does not grade, it tallies outcomes. A lineage that learns to modulate appetites, to treat energy flux as current rather than cash, to leave buffers intact, drifts past this quiet filter. The trial, if trial exists, reads like ethics made from physics. Do cycles remain closed? Do debts pay themselves back with interest in soil, in air, in time? Another filter may sit in translation itself. Minds shaped by different ecologies may fail to overlap in signal space. Chlorophyll edges and oxygen-methane tension make a kind of universal grammar, but culture-specific beacons, narrowband radio, laser pulses, encoded bursts, assume shared convention. A sanctuary planet might prioritize reciprocity with microbes, forests, and oceans over shout into wind. The field's own logic encourages inward coherence first, outward curiosity. Second, not as moral order, but as energetics. Stability before broadcast, metabolism before monument. The voice circles back to contingency. Thresholds rarely occur because they are required. They occur because permissive contexts align. A shallow sea at a certain chemistry, a corridor opening at the right latitude, a partnership that stumbles into symbiosis instead of digestion. The great filter, reframed, is a probability landscape. Many valleys of easy outcomes, a few narrow passes leading to high plateaus. Earth may be such a pass, not unique but uncommon, its sanctuary quality less about walls and more about redundancy. Multiple ways to hold warmth, to move nutrients, to recover after stumbles. From outside, a filter reads like absence of voices beyond a certain distance. From inside, it reads like a stack of unremarkable chores that must be tended without ceasing. Keep soil dark with carbon. Keep water moving. Keep fertility cycling. Keep stories honest enough that memory survives power. None announce themselves as cosmic tasks. They feel like gardening. Perhaps that is the point. A field framed as test may be testing ordinary virtues, patience, repair, listening, emergent behaviors that help any system remain conversational with itself. Skepticism sits nearby, steady as a stone. Maybe there is no filter at all, only vastness and scarcity, only our impatience with silence. Maybe thresholds feel important because minds love thresholds. The record remains the record. Slow oxygenation, rare endosymbiosis, long stabilities interrupted by unplanned edits. Whether this sums to a barrier or a path is a matter of metaphor. The path image comforts because it leaves room for walking. Night folds around the thought. In the quiet, the field looks as it always does. Clouds passing, currents turning, roots widening, ice forming and relaxing. If there is a filter, it is not a guillotine. It is a fog that asks for careful steps and redundant maps. If there is a sanctuary, it is not walled. It is a resilience made from overlapping cycles that accept surprise without collapse. Earth stands somewhere within these shapes, neither exam hall nor playground, neither hazard course nor cradle, but a place that asks for slowness. The listener breathes with that pace, and the question, still open, rests gently beside the dark. Clay lies where water lingers and then leaves, where rivers slow to think, where shores flatten into patience. It is a fine-grained hush, plates of silica and alumina stacked like thin pages, each sheet bearing a small negative charge that invites cations to sit between layers the way bookmarks rest in a book. The pages swell when wet, shrink when dry, and with each cycle the spacing breathes. If Earth is a test field, clay acts like an assistant who loves preparation, arranging molecules close, holding them steady, letting them try combinations they would miss in open water. What looks like mud behaves as a classroom. Along the edges of these sheets, broken bonds wait like open hands. Sodium or calcium settle first. Organics follow, attracted by charge and by the comfort of a flat, structured surface. Fatty acids lay their heads against the planes and hide their tails, assembling into films that curl into vesicles when nudged. Small rooms with walls that keep a moment longer than chance provides. Nucleotides, those shy monomers, line up on certain clays. Montmorillonite is generous, and the surface encourages their linking. The sheets act as jigs, guiding bonds by geometry and by a faint electrical hunger. In warm, evaporating pools, wet-dry cycles concentrate these monomers. Clay hosts the meetings. The meetings produce chains not long, but long enough to hint that language can begin as a whisper scribbled in dust. Not all clays behave the same. Kaolinite stays prim and close. Montmorillonite swells with water, widening its galleries like a library opening stacks. Elite holds tight to some guests and lets others pass. The cation exchange capacity of a clay, its willingness to trade ions, is a quiet metric of its sociability, a measure that translates into chemistry's version of tact. Edges carry different personalities from faces. Interlayers differ from outer surfaces. In this diversity of microrooms, molecules choose seats. The arrangement resembles a party held for monomers where hosts seat unlikely neighbors and watch for conversation. Reactions that stumble in open water often walk on mineral floors. Theosters, energetic intermediates, cling and share, offering fragments in a market of carbon. Phosphates, ordinarily reluctant to bond, find encouragement when pressed against structured charge. Amino acids, awkward alone, form small peptides. When films thin, when water leaves, when heat and clay conspire to make proximity feel fated. Each event remains improbable in isolation, but the surface repeats the try without fatigue. Clay does not tire. It holds and releases, displays and hides, a quiet operator of chance. Within narrow pores, the temperature differs from the open. Evaporation deepens sooner. A gradient steepens. Thermophoresis nudges larger things toward the cooler end, enriching certain corners. In these corners, lipids trap catalysts. Catalysts meet strands. Strands find templates. A vesicle becomes a small tide pool within a larger one, a room inside a room. If an RNA-like chain forms and folds into a shape that coaxes more of itself, the walls keep it long enough to act. If a fold acts badly, the room rinses and tries again. The field practices selection without needing organisms to do it. It simply favors persistence at surfaces and in niches where loss slows. Patterns bloom unasked. Reaction diffusion waves ripple across gels. Colored fronts chase each other and resolve into spots and rings. On clays dusted with simple reactants, autocatalysis can trace labyrinths, the chemistry mapping itself in moving gradients. These are not thoughts, but they carry a faint kinship. Signals traversing a medium, one patch affecting another through distance and delay. In some corners, iron-sulfur clusters assemble in the lattice, miniature copies of cofactors that modern. Enzymes cradle at their cores. The echo grows stronger. Mineral grammar first, biological sentence later. Even in mud, memory exists. A clay stirred and settled holds a different arrangement of adsorbed molecules than a clay dried and re-wetted. Hysteresis rides the loop between states. A film forced to flow thins and then thickens again when left alone. Thixotropy documents stress in viscosity. These are quiet physical memories. No symbols, only altered responses to similar conditions, depending on the path taken to arrive. A pond bottom thus remembers weather as texture. A tidal flat remembers last week's sun in the way it accepts today's. If mind is partly the ability to remember and use the memory to shape new response, the earliest echoes of that ability may belong to matter long before neurons appear. Clays also sort chirality with a mild, imperfect preference. Some faces favor left-handed or right-handed versions of a molecule by a trace, a bias multiplied when cycles repeat. On calcite, terraces hand one enantiomer a kinder fit. On certain zeolites, pores prefer one twist to another. The preference is slight, yet cycles love slight. When drying and wetting, heating and cooling, adsorbing and desorbing repeat across thousands of dawns, a fraction can grow into a habit. A planet that favors a hand in its sugars and amino acids does not need a designer's instruction. It needs a million small tilts applied over long afternoons. The setting is ordinary. A river, mouth at low tide, sunlight warming a thin film, a breeze nudging water into retreat. Or a lake margin, where waves run out of breath and leave silt to steam and crack. In those seconds before dusk, concentrations climb. In the night, dew softens the view and brings fresh mobility. Day after day, the routine replays. Clay sits at the threshold, translating cycles into structure. What sticks today informs what sticks tomorrow. With time, compartments learn to keep. Templates learn to extend. Catalysts learn to attend to their preferred partners. The verbs here remain metaphors, but the pattern does not. Retention rises where surfaces help. Some imagine a different echo, that once cells exist and later brains, the intimacy with mineral logic persists in new guises. Neurons traffic ions as clays do. Membranes adjust their excitability with adsorbed molecules. Synapses strengthen with use, weaken with disuse. Another form of hysteresis, sculpted by enzymes and scaffolds rather than by swelling sheets. Assemblies. Of many simple units, each with local rules, produce global waves, oscillations, and avalanches that cross tissue the way reaction fronts cross gels. Mind becomes a late, agile version of a story matter has told for eons. Gradients molding flow, surfaces guiding form, memory arising as path dependence. Machines inherit a similar grammar. A network that learns changes its internal weights through repeated exposure, a numerical clay that thickens or thins its response where past inputs pressed. Reservoirs, physical or simulated, compute by exploiting rich, fading memory and dynamics. A stirred medium serves as calculator not by symbol, but by response. To see mud as ancestor to math is not to diminish thought. It is to soften it back into continuity with physics. The field may test whether complexity can ride such continuity without breaking it, whether mind can remain humble to materials. Skepticism sits quietly here too. Some polymerizations on clay remain short. Replication fidelity is low. Fat vesicles leak. Chains hydrolyze. What looks plausible in a dish may feel rare in a world. What forms in a pore may not survive a storm. Yet cycles counter rarity with repetition. A choice that succeeds once can be reenacted 1,000 times if the room persists. Clay provides rooms that persist more than bare water does. In that persistence, probability bends. Elsewhere, minerals besides clay offer instruction. Ices that template chains in thin veins, basalts with catalytic metal tips, evaporates that concentrate solutes to stubbornness. Clay holds the spotlight because it combines abundance, charge, swelling, and tact. It sticks to the skin and to the tongue. It lines ancient pots and newborn riverbanks. It is common enough to be an everyman of surfaces. If a world wants to teach molecules patience, clay is a fitting desk. Night comes down over a flat, bright mudflat as heat leaves. Cracks outline polygons like dried thoughts. In the shallow fractures, a thin film remains, a last reserve where molecules keep moving after larger pools rest. Stars look down and offer nothing beyond position and period. The field continues. Its a small lesson. Place, hold, nudge, release, again, again. If mind someday rises there or elsewhere, its first dreams may be of clay not because clay imagines, but because clay remembers, instructs, and composes by repetition. The dream needs no owner. It needs only surfaces inclined to help and time willing to sit with them. Night settles over continents and the planet answers with patterns it did not inherit. Lines appear where none existed yesterday. Threads of light that cross plains, climb valleys, and draw sharp corners along coasts. The glow is neither moon nor firelight. It is a grid humming softly, a lattice of electrons persuaded to move and then told where to stop. From orbit, the skin of Earth blushes in points and filaments, a nervous system revealed by its own excitations. If Earth is a test field, perhaps this after-sunset radiance functions like a readout, a status light, an accidental announcement that a certain choreography has begun. The lights collect in predictable ecologies. Densities spike at river deltas and along straits, scrawl across dry plateaus where water is piped and pumped, drape the edges of mountains as if contour lines suddenly learn to glow. They leave dark islands where forest and ice remain, where desert dunes make motion difficult, where the sea keeps its wide room. Yet even the sea now writes in sparks. Fishing fleets stitching dotted ellipses along upwelling fronts, gas flares blooming over waters pulled from deep rock, ships pausing. Outside, harbors like constellations unpinned and lowered a few hundred meters. The color tells a slow story. Old lamps warm the night in amber. Newer diodes trend cold or softened to mimic a memory of flame. Spectra shift with policy and price and fashion. An instrument watching for decades could see decisions as a wavelength, population as intensity, Efficiency as the same brightness with less current or the same current with more brightness. The grid breathes by hour and season. Dinner peaks, winter peaks, a long nocturne that rises with cooling and falls with sleep. Curves trace daily. Habits, while storms and holidays draw their own signatures, transient and clear. At ground level, the night is not one thing anymore. Skies leave cities reluctantly, grading from white to gray to a black that, once common, becomes rare. Moths circle artificially steady moons, migrating birds bend from course, turtles misread bright horizons, flowers that set seed by the logic of dark and light receive mixed messages. Some species adapt, some retreat, some vanish from certain thresholds of brightness as quietly as dew. The light's arithmetic is gentle, many small fixtures rather than a few bonfires, and yet summation matters. Each bulb agrees without ever meeting the others to build a sky that settles closer than it used to. Heat joins light as a twin language. Asphalt and brick store day and surrender it slowly. Waste heat from engines, servers, and industry adds a thin extra layer to the night's long-wave glow. Over cities, the boundary layer lifts and stirs. Convection persists. The urban heat island spreads like a soft dome. Breezes adjust. Rain patterns nudge downwind. Fog thins or thickens. Thunder shifts. The grid does not end at the lamp. It includes all those transformations necessary to keep the lamp true: mines, refineries, pylons, transformers, and all the consequences that follow from their order and efficiency. The planet reads the sum as joules turn to brightness and then to heat, to chemistry, to altered flows. From above, the grid resembles information more than matter. A sensor that favors dim scenes, the night vision of orbit, detects the gentle lace and keeps a calendar. Lights grow and recede, grow again, flicker with crisis, then return. New roads bead, old ones go thin. Regions brighten with prosperity and dim with restraint, with collapse, with preference for dark. In storms, power fails, and a city becomes coastline again, its river mouth the only luminous certainty. In wars, blackouts erase expected constellations. In rebuilding, towers rise and announce themselves as vertical lines in a long exposure of wind and haze. The planet writes its diary. In lumen hours and kilowatt signatures the way it writes in pollen and D13C, different alphabets, same insistence on record. Under streetlights, water renegotiates. Impervious surfaces speed runoff. Gutters speak in sudden voices. Rivers learn new hydrographs with sharper peaks, quicker declines. Heat and aerosols seed clouds that return rain unevenly. After midnight, when demand slumps, reservoirs resume their own pace. Treatment plants hum in lower keys. Pumps rest in short, true sleeps. Even in the city's slowed hour, the grid remains vigilant, a tide that rarely ebbs to silence. This vigilance, from a planetary perspective, is unusual. For billions of years, nights belonged to radiative coolness, to stars and insects and owls. Now the city keeps a rhythm that ignores the sky and listens instead to contracts and screens. Spectra betray intent more than brightness does. Sodium lamps declare a narrow peak. Mercury adds its pale signatures. LEDs can be tuned widely, and their adoption writes a new palette into space. A watcher with patient optics could read this palette as biography. When municipalities changed, when fishing fleets shifted tactics, when refineries idled. The lights say nothing directly about the thoughts that led to their arrangement. They say what is: energy moving, resources organized, attention directed. They say we are here and awake longer than darkness suggests. We are reading and cooking and driving. We are keeping rooms at certain temperatures. We are rehearsing our own weather. Waste heat speaks in wavelengths no human eye follows but any. Thermal instrument can savor. Rooftops glow slightly. Exhaust plumes are soft torches invisible to glass. Data centers prickle. Power plants exhale. The aggregate emission is small against the sun's income and the atmosphere's greenhouse accounting, but locally it matters, and potentially, when scaled far into an imagined future, it could compete with climatic forces. The grid's heat is a friendly byproduct until concentrations and trends make it a shaper of habitats. The field observes, indifferent but attentive, willing to reroute cycles around new obstacles if the obstacles persist. Economies locate themselves in the network, with light as proxy. Gross measures correlate. More lumens, more transactions, more stability, steadier patterns. Yet the correlation is not destiny. Dark places can be prosperous by choice, with shielded lamps and mindful building. Bright places can be poor, with flares and fires and unregulated glow. Fishing grounds gleam brilliantly for a season and then go dark when the shoals shift or rules arrive. Gas flares sparkle and then fade with pipelines built. The night map is a pulse, not a manifesto, a truth bound to infrastructure's current state rather than to values. If a reader across space looks, what do they learn? That a biosphere achieves an energy density that deforms night, that oscillates with a time-of-use logic foreign to tides and monsoons, that spectra cluster into artificial families distinct from aurora and lightning and wildfire, that light anchors to grids whose geometry reflects roads and land tenure and terrain, that the planet radiates slightly more mid-infrared around clusters of habitation than geology alone accounts for. Would that reader call this intelligence or merely persistence? Perhaps they would recognize the signature because they own one too. Perhaps they would call it a phase, an adolescence, a brief blinking before a quieter maturity that uses less to do more. The city itself may be the test. Whether living among densities of light and heat can coexist with cycles that preceded them. Rivers, soils, winds. A nocturnal ecology remains possible under shades and shields. Circadian rhythms can be respected with warmer spectra and timing. Energy can be routed through forms that produce less heat and less haze. The grid could dim and still inform, could glow where useful and rest where not, could let stars back into the script. The field does not demand this. It simply measures whether feedbacks close, whether a bright night still allows dew on leaves, and coolness before dawn. Skepticism stands where measurement does. Night lights do not tell everything. They miss indoor labor, quiet craft, off-grid resilience. They misread flares as cities, ships as villages, fireworks as settlements. Clouds. Confuse, snow amplifies, smoke lies. But in the long average the pattern speaks, and its gentleness, no explosions of color, no harsh edges, hides the intensity of organization behind it. Copper ores mined, silicon refined, pylons set, laws written, lives arranged around outlets, and switches. The beacons blink because innumerable agreements hold. Midnight advances. Power demand lowers to its valley. Offices dim, kitchens cool, roads empty except for steady arteries that never sleep. In the lull, the glow still drapes sky, a low ceiling over rooftops. Somewhere a substation hums like a distant insect. Somewhere a control room watches graphs ripple and settle. Somewhere a migrating bird veers from a tower's brief confusion and regains its route. If Earth is a test field, this might be one of its current questions. Do these lights announce a result, or do they only announce an attempt? The grid does not answer. It breathes. By morning, the lamps will yield to leaves and clouds and the ancient brightness that requires nothing from wires. For now, the planet holds both lights at once and lets the night be slightly less dark. Silt waits with infinite patience. It drifts and settles in corners where motion slackens. Behind a fallen wall, inside a stairwell flooded by a river that forgets its banks for a season, under bridges that become weirs when driftwood lodges and will not let go. If the species that strings lights across night grows quiet and thins, the field does not hurry to erase. It chooses a slower kindness. It covers. The city softens beneath that covering, edges rounding the way bones round in sand. The first chapter. After us is sediment. Deltas step seaward each spring and then relax in storm. Untended levees slump and allow old water to walk in remembered channels. Where pumps stop, low ground becomes lake, and lake becomes marsh, and marsh becomes peat that tastes of brick and salt. Grasses climb through floors, concrete cools, cracks, takes on a skin of lichen. Rebar swells with rust and pries apart the hand that once held stone together. Roman harbors linger in seawater because ash and lime made a chemistry that likes interaction with the sea. Modern mixes vary, many strong for decades and then fizzle to the long medicine of chloride and thyme. The silt does not choose among them. It only takes advantage when a surface roughens enough to catch a grain. In reservoirs, trapped sediment mounds into deltas of its own, fine as flour. When dams stand without care, the water works around, through, under, until a single wet morning brings a new canyon and a fast downdraw. Downstream, a coarse pulse travels like an exhale. Upstream, the quiet basin becomes meadow and then woodland, the old shorelines fading into terraces of gullies and grass. Years later, a core through that meadow reads the moment of the breach as a bright jump in grain size, a line of seeds more than usual, a brief abundance of charcoal. The flood writes itself the way all floods do, clearly, without malice, and then the silt resumes its softer script. Landfills turn into mesas. They are already layered, paper and polymer, bone and tin, glass and cloth, lifted and compacted, covered with clay and seeded with grass. Left alone, they dry, subside, re-wet, and begin to close their chemistry. Methane finds its way upward, in thin, patient plumes. Metals diffuse outward until minerals once mined for them become unmined by slow weather. Plastics embrittle, fracture, waxify, and move toward molecules of simpler ambition. In the quiet portion under water and away from oxygen, some polymers persist longer, pressed and cooled, perhaps altered by heat from decay into new waxes that are neither monomer nor familiar plastic, residues that future readers may meet as odd seams in mud, hydrophobic and stubborn under solvent. Elsewhere, the remnants concentrate themselves. Streets turn to elevated ridges as the interstitial soil moves and gutters fill. Rails rust to red filigree and then to nothing, while their beds of crushed stone act as long, armored berms that steer runoff. Bridges fall to meet their piers, which stand like teeth until the first thick floods quarry them away. Ports subside. The lines of quay walls and breakwaters become orientation marks to waves, constructing bars that rework the coastline to the old geometry, then discard it. Under shallow seas, cables that once exchanged light between continents sag and bury. Their armor unwinds under currents, copper oxidizes. The trace is first a line of metal, and later a faint enrichment in sediments as narrow as a footpath. The archive of breath does not misplace the brief bloom. Carbon's ratio in the air and surface ocean leans light. Nitrate and sulfate strum. A century-scale chord. Lead rises and then falls. Black carbon curves with regulations and fire. Fly ash spheres dot 100 lakes like punctuation. Microplastics ride rivers into deltas and offshore fans, then settle in anoxic basins as a pale confetti mixed with diatoms and coccoliths. The strand of tritium tied to tests loses volume with each half-life. Plutonium and cesium sink and bind to clays and later barely whisper. In 10 millennia, a subtle disequilibrium remains, then less. In a million years, isotope ghosts from the machines fade into the larger murmur. What endures is the pattern of change, the suddenness, the synchrony across basins, the narrowness of the brushstroke between magnetic waypoints. The field remembers speed as much as substance. Animals leave a different clarity. Chickens become a fossil as common as any Pleistocene shell, not because they are extraordinary, but because their bones are many and discarded in places that bury them: landfills, pits, lakes near towns. Their proportions, chests heavy from breeding, read as a brief morphology tied to appetite and commerce. Rats and dogs and cats appear in numbers unkind to the larger quiet of rivers. Cow and pig join where pastures slump into ponds. In caves, swallows' nests layer over graffiti that flakes and falls. On reefs, old pilings become stumps around which corals write their own dense accounting, overwriting by living addition. Metals return to ore by other names. Buried cities become future mines, not of copper in veins, but copper in diffuse veins of wire and motor and pipe. A reader who evolves or arrives later may map the collective metal as a gradient rather than a load, a smear of recoverable inheritance across a horizon. Aluminum, so hard-won from bauxite and electricity, oxidizes to powder and hides as clays that ask for energy again to yield shine. Gold keeps itself, as it always has, in thin threads stubbornly bright. Its artifacts, if trapped away from abrasion, endure like small suns under dust. Ceramics and glass hold best. Their silica networks content to sit and wait. Devitrifying slowly, opalizing in flow, fracturing but not dissolving. Pottery shards outlast texts by orders of time, and the potsherd again becomes a reasonable line in a future folio. Here they carried water, here oil, here grain. The story is familiar because fired clay reads as geology that chose a shape. Code fails faster. Magnetic states forget. Charges leak. Pits etched in disks scuff. Foam and varnish delaminate. Inks fade if they were never meant to meet a century. Stone carved with alphabets persists, but the number of stones per byte is small, and the writing that remains is therefore gesture rather than archive, hymn rather than database. Ashes of libraries lift on winds as they always have. Some minds choose to store text in DNA and hide it in salt caves or deep in ice, but cycles gnaw at both. Crystals flow, permafrost wanders, people break into vaults when they need shelter. Code lives longest when it becomes behavior. Tools shape bones. City plans shape river courses. Domestication shapes seeds and hooves. The logic of right angles shapes how wind spills down the sides of a vanished tower into patterns of sand that a future geometer might recognize as the echo of an orthogonal mind. On the moon, flags bleach and crumble. Footprints soften slowly under micrometeorite rain. Retroreflectors still throw back photons for a while. On Mars, tracks sleep under dust and may wake again under a cleaning wind. These artifacts persist not because they resist time, but because time there is thinner. They say less about meaning than about environments. There is comfort in that. That meaning for a field arises from cycles, not from monuments. Monuments are marginalia. The main text remains tides, rains, and silt. Some imagine warning markers over deep wastes, fields of black stone shaped to repel curiosity. The stones last for centuries, millennia perhaps, then join the desert's work. Etched by dust, toppled by quake, taken as quarries by a species that returns with different needs. The wastes themselves decay toward less dangerous daughters, their signal paling on the scale of dozens of millennia. The field, if it tests the humility of advice across time. Most advice fails to arrive. Most danger passes before the advice does. The silt is not cruel in this. It merely insists that messages must be written into process to be read at all. This insistence suggests a gentler legacy. Cycles repaired, soils dark again with carbon, rivers given room, reefs given rest. Arrangements that archive intention, as resilience rather than as inscription. If a later reader walks this layer, the legible kindness would be continuity. Fewer sharp breaks, fewer sudden spikes, a smoothing of curves that made room for many lives. Even absence can be a line in the core, plastics declining before unknown replacements that leave less trace, soot decreasing not because fire ends, but because fuels change. Nitrogen pulses narrowed around the patient business of root and rain. The field would understand that language. It speaks it already. And if a reader is not someone from elsewhere but someone from here, descended from crows or octopuses or trees that learn a new speed of responsiveness, the archive they inherit is partly theirs already. Seeds that remember. Cultivation. Shorelines tuned by dams long gone. Soils rearranged by plow and hoof. Islands built from rubble turned to rookery. They would not need to decipher code to know what came before. They would read it in silt and slope, in the isotopes of carbon in their bones, in the presence of metals in their rivers, in the thin, strange seams of wax that skip through clay like unseasonal frost. Night folds over the quiet grid. Where lamps, once stitched valleys, fireflies sow for a week and then rest. Dew comes back to rooftops that now host moss. Wind carries sand onto lanes that lead nowhere anyone remembers. The silt continues to fall, to fill, to hold a soft, unarguable memory. If Earth is a test field, this is one of its most forgiving. Conclusions: that after the bright experiment of cities, the planet knows how to keep the part of the result that matters, conditions that allow life to keep trying, and to file the rest under texture, under trace, under the calm arithmetic of layers. A quiet thought turns outward, beyond coastlines of air and belts of dust, toward a possibility that does not need drama to feel large, that far apart, under different suns, worlds keep notebooks, and from time to time those notebooks are compared, not in congresses or ceremonies, not in federations or edicts, but in the slow, impersonal exchange of light and heat and pattern, the kind a patient watcher can learn to read. If Earth is a test field, perhaps the cosmos itself acts like a peer reviewer, not to approve or reject, but to offer context. Here is what happened elsewhere when similar pressures applied. The review begins with baselines. Planets share certain grammars. Gravity arranging fluid and grain. Orbits modulating seasons. Interiors cooling and convecting. A watcher can recognize these grammars across light years in the way a spectrum leans, in the way day and night differ, in the rhythm of a rotation written into the dimming of a star. An atmosphere that stays for billions of years under high radiation earns a note. Retention under stress. A magnetic field persisting longer than its dynamo model predicts adds another. Unexpected endurance. Oceans that glint. Clouds that pace. Latitudes. Deserts that organize into bands. The first layer of review says only, yes, that fits physics, and thereby frees curiosity for the deviations. Deviations carry the flavor of results. A planet close to a small red sun might show wild flares early in its life, then a calming as the star settles. A biosphere there, if it arises, learns different strategies. Pigments tuned to longer light, shelters against bursts, circadian, clocks yoked more to internal feedback than to firm diurnal cues. If such a world glows with oxygen beside methane in a steady disequilibrium, the signal becomes a case study, how life maintains tension under harsh variability. Another world, farther from its pale star, may glow with a different greenhouse, hydrogen-rich perhaps, and still manage liquid water under a dim lamp. The note there reads, habitability by excess rather than by closeness, an alternative route offered to anyone who needs it. Over centuries and millennia, signals accumulate. A watcher catalogs phase curves, albedo maps, transit spectra, thermal emissions, stacks of faint lines that together form the outline of a system's temperament. Some systems show sharp transitions, sudden clearing of aerosols consistent with cryovolcanic lulls, abrupt dimming in mid-infrared that might be a ring arc shifting or dust lanes swept. Others display remarkable steadiness across epochs, implying feedbacks robust enough to chew through provocation without much drama. The review does not grade. It juxtaposes. This world learned moderation under a red dwarf, the margin says. This one learned patience without plate tectonics. This one never left microbial suns. Its biology kept the surface dull and the air breathable. The comments read like field notes from a long walk, technological signatures, if and e. When they appear, enter as footnotes to the larger climate and chemistry. Waste heat tallies, unusual gases, lights that pulse with a regularity absent in weather, shades that wheel before a star with geometric discipline. These add texture. A planet that brightens in the infrared beyond geological accounting suggests industry. One that dims its artificial night as decades pass implies efficiency or retreat. One whose spectra show engineered molecules in parts per trillion for centuries implies a long conversation with toxicity. Each case teaches a narrow thing: how to keep cooling while thinking faster, how to respect dark while moving safely, how to fold contrivance into cycles that forgive. The reviewing eye is not necessarily a person. It might be a distributed patience, instruments and algorithms that err toward humility, tuned by minds that learned the cost of presumption. It might be another biosphere listening the way planes listen to rain, simply taking in, adjusting, thresholds, letting rare events change standards while keeping the rest unperturbed. Peer review at this scale is less a courtroom than an ecology of attention. Inputs flow, thresholds adapt, outliers prompt new questions, baselines adjust slowly, nothing concludes. Earth contributes to this exchange without trying. Its record of snow and bloom, of oxygen's rise, of endosymbiosis, of ice that remembers air, of crust that writes in stripes, of deserts that solve equations, of forests that call rain, of cities that announce themselves in spectra. These are pages anyone could, in principle, read. A watcher far away might trace the steepening of nightlights beginning in one century and softening in another, might observe a mid-infrared plateau that grows and then levels, might taste a swift century-scale slope in D13C by proxy and then a gentle warping back toward older values, might notice halogenated gases arriving and then declining. The margins on Earth's page could say, adolescence visible, course correction attempted, metronomic tides maintained, forests speaking again after a hush. Culture, if it endures, gradually moves from spectacle to subtlety in its signals. Early calls are loud, beacons, broadcasts, energetic leakage. Later, the same cleverness that built channels learns to turn them inward, toward efficiency, privacy, darkness, silence. The peer reviewer sees less but infers more. Coherence persists without waste. Illumination concentrates only where hands and eyes are. Information travels inside fibers and matter rather than sprayed into sky. A dimming that preserves the red edge and the chemical tension of air reads as a result, not a fade. Stability gained with smaller signature. This is not a universal arc, only a plausible one among many. The review resists teleology. It simply notes that some systems choose modesty and thrive. Contact in the overt sense may never figure in this review. Messages cross slowly and return. Later than senders survive. Languages mutate between send and answer. Clouds and ice and continents scramble the meaning if it was bound to any one form of symbol. But method survives better than message. The how of observation, the patience of cycles, the willingness to keep uncertainty visible, these translate by example. A civilization that watches its own field with kindness may become legible to others attempting the same, not by code, but by behavior. A world that refuses to sacrifice its long feedbacks for short cravings emits a signature of continuity that anyone measuring longevity can detect. Seasonality intact, river chemistry near old bounds, aerosols variable but bounded, night mostly. Dark, disagreements also travel. Some watchers weight oxygen too heavily. Some trust methane. Some expect pigments. Some consider life possible in solvents that water would disdain. The review then becomes a chorus of hypotheses tested across many skies. The plurality is not a bug. It is the virtue that keeps a field from washing out unusual cases. When a planet displays a chemistry no template can hold, the review does not dismiss. It branches. The peer process at cosmic scale learns to avoid consensus by force, preferring coherence by accumulation. Patterns that recur across many worlds gain weight. Patterns seen once are treasured and checked again, not argued away. Earth, in reading others, learns its own uniqueness and its ordinariness. Unique, a large moon, long-lived plate tectonics, oceans that refuse to boil or freeze entirely, a balance of greenhouse gases tuned by rock and root, a habit of multicellularity that traveled far, a technological adolescence that coincided with instruments able to see it. Ordinary, gravity, chemistry, dust, the joy of cycles, the sobriety of feedbacks, the tenderness of thresholds, the quiet of deserts solving for wind. The comparison tempers pride and despair. It replaces isolation with membership. Even if no signal is returned, the act of holding one's page alongside the imagined pages of others changes how the writing proceeds. Skepticism stays close. Many of these inferences float on small lines of data, on spectra with low signal-to-noise, on models that extrapolate generously. False positives and missed signatures abound. Yet the peer review holds not because every result is certain, but because corrections follow. A molecule misassigned is retired with gratitude. A glint assumed to be ocean is reclassified as cloud. A light curve once blamed on a megastructure becomes dust. The humility of the process, its willingness to revise without melodrama, becomes a shared ethic that itself is legible. Systems run by minds that accept error endure longer than those that cannot. On nights when clouds part, small telescopes on hills, some run by communities, some by schools, some by solitary enthusiasts, gather light from nearby stars. Those photons have spent years in the dark. They arrive, touch a sensor, add a count to a bin, join other counts to draw a line. The line becomes a curve. The curve becomes a season. The season becomes an orbit pinned. The orbit becomes a prediction. The prediction enables a joint observation with someone elsewhere on the planet who also chose to go outside. This collaborative patience, mundane and tender, is the local face of cosmic peer review. It needs no committee. It needs weather and time and willingness. The thought softens at its edges. Perhaps the review is nothing more than the universe being legible in more than one place. Perhaps there are no readers beyond those here. Perhaps there are many, and they are busy. Either way, the comparisons exist. Physics ensures analogy. Chemistry ensures rhyme. If Earth is a test field, it participates by both writing and reading, placing its curves alongside others, adjusting what can be adjusted, leaving the rest to patience. The page is long, the margins wide, the ink faint but durable. The listener feels the comfort of being one voice among possible voices, even if none are heard. The night is a large, calm room, and the stars are lights left on for anyone who needs them. The thought arrives as lightly as mist across a meadow before sunrise. Perhaps the test is simply to notice, not to conquer the ledger or to decode every proxy, not to solve the question like a lock, but to attend, to let breath slow until the quiet operations of stone and water, leaf and cloud, become audible. In this way, the field becomes contemplative, rather than contested. The planet does not request worship or conquest. It grants occasions for care. The voice lingers in this open space, patient, unhurried, letting each earlier image drift back and take a seat. A crystal still rests in a slide somewhere, carrying 1 billion years in a grain no larger than a punctuation mark. Its uranium, slowly, becomes lead. Its oxygen tilts toward a memory of water. To notice is to accept that such a ledger needs no belief to be true. On a shelf not far away, a cylinder of seafloor mud darkens toward its base, foraminifera stacked like snow in a long jar of time. Internal waves pass under moonlit surfaces. Manganese nodules grow rings too fine for seasons. Dust falls as a soft arithmetic. To notice is to let scale widen until patience itself feels like substance. Ice holds breath. Bubbles blur, then sharpen on warming. A small hiss announces air older than cities. The sound is not message but condition, and yet a listener hears, meaning in it, the persistence of cycles through cold and light. Basalts cool into hexagons. Deserts lift grains into ripples that select their own spacing. Forests open pores and cool the afternoon by lifting rivers into sky. The moon pulls a tide across mudflats and turns marshes into calendars. None of these gestures claim intention, and still they invite an answer. The most available answer is attention. Elsewhere, vents at midnight keep their warm chemistries running. Metal sulfides line pores like tiny altars to gradients. Vesicles form and divide by the luck of shear. Clays hold monomers and urge them toward chain. The scene remains both plausible and unresolved, an ever-present prelude that modern life passes without needing to repeat. Noticing here is humility, willingness to say perhaps, willingness to let partial be sufficient for wonder. The field does not demand closure. It keeps trying, and the trying itself is legible. Across the sky, signals travel that no ear hears unaided. Leaves reflect a red edge. Gases oppose one another in durable disequilibrium. Cities blur night into a new palette. Waste heat lifts, a mild, extra warmth. These, too, are invitations rather than verdicts. To notice is to learn restraint. To dim when dimming lets stars return. To insulate until heat leaks less. To shield lamps so that turtles and migrating birds can read horizons. Again, attention may change conduct not by law but by intimacy. The way a walker steps more softly after seeing tracks of fox and wren along a path still wet with dew. Magnetism turns pages without asking permission. Lavas take direction as they cool. Clays accept a gentle alignment as they set. Trees grow rings that count slower days. Beryllium rises when the shield thins. The world offers timing marks that are both unavoidable and generous. Peer review at cosmic scale, if it exists, may be nothing more than this: many worlds leaving many such marks, each readable by anyone patient enough to look. A reader compares stripes and bubbles, glints and spectra, and learns that difference and rhyme can coexist without reducing either to rule. Resets arrive as they always have. Ash and spherules, flood basalts and black shales, fern spikes and small-bodied recoveries. Noticing here becomes a quiet ethic. If the likelihood of upheaval never falls to zero, then gentleness in the intervals might be the most consequential art. Soil kept dark with carbon, headwaters left with room to meander, fisheries taught to breathe by rest. A field that tests thresholds does not grade on heroism. It rewards persistence. Attention, spread over years, becomes resilience. The desert continues its mathematics in silence. The forest continues its vapor and scent. Coasts keep their metronome of tide and their choir of intertidal clocks. Cities keep their grids but learn perhaps to blush less and to sleep more. The ledger of carbon continues to slope and then to ease. Code frays. Clay remembers. Silt covers. Nothing in this requires a supervisor beyond physics. Everything in this welcomes witness. What, then, is being examined? Maybe nothing more than whether noticing can become habit, whether minds evolved for quick signals can remain present for slow ones, whether a culture can accept partial knowing without retreating into spectacle or certainty. The planet seems to teach by repetition. Try, erase, try, keep, open a corridor, close it, open another, hold a gradient, let it fade, find a different one. The biosphere answers by improvisation. Attention answers by keeping tempo with both patience and change. There is a way of noticing that does not pull apart. It allows context to stay intact. Zircons as notes inside mountains, cores as echoes inside oceans. Nightlights as a phase in a longer curve that also includes fireflies and dew. It accepts the ambiguity between artifact and geofact, between planned edge and emergent hexagon, and waits for chords rather than single notes to decide. It keeps skepticism close, not as gatekeeper, but as companion, the one who asks for another. Proxy, another core, another time series, and is willing to sit with whatever comes. There is also a way of noticing that alters the noticed. A shielded lamp brings stars back. A restored floodplain teaches a river to remember the shape of its own patience. A reef spared from crowding resumes its slow masonry. A fishery that rests brings back its predators and their isotopes. An urban night cooled by trees and water returns sleep to bodies that forgot it. These are not proofs of purpose. They are consequences of listening. The test may reside less in passing and more in learning, that the examiner, if any exists at all, is indistinguishable from the field itself, and that the field responds to kindness with room. Silence remains available. No one needs to broadcast. To be real, a civilization could choose to let the sky be black and the air be plain, and still write its presence into stable cycles, into a red edge steady through centuries, into a chemistry that returns to narrow lanes and stays there. Anyone watching from far away might call that restraint. Up close it would feel ordinary, the way a tide pool feels ordinary until one kneels. The discipline of attention makes ordinary luminous. The listener's breath slows further. The room grows larger without changing. Outside, a river runs under a bridge that may not last. Inside, a single phrase repeats, "Perhaps the test is to notice." Notice the metronomes, day and tide and season. Notice the simple ambitions of clays and gradients. Notice the generous redundancies, several ways to carry warmth, several to move nutrients, several to rest. Notice when novelty hurries faster, then buffers and slow it with the oldest tools, shade, soil, time. Nothing concludes here. The field goes on, unimpressed by closure and friendly to repetition. The thought drifts like a small boat away from shore. What if Earth is just a test field? What if the test is simply to notice? What if noticing, repeated and shared, is enough to let the rest take care of itself? The boat becomes a dot on a wide calm. The dot becomes a feeling rather than an object. The feeling lingers like cool air after rain. The night accepts it and adds no comment, which is comment enough. Night loosens its seams. The field lies quiet. Water smoothing stones in a rhythm older than clocks. Grasses resting with dew poised like breath on a lip. Stars holding still as if listening. The planet turns with the calm certainty of a sleeper rolling once and settling. The listener's breathing slows to match it. Thought thins to a gentle thread. Clouds pale toward invisibility. Their edges soften until edges are only memory. Far away, a tide leans inward and then outward, a hush of weight returning to weight. Forest crowns cool and offer back what they kept from afternoon. Dust in the high air drifts like small, bright intentions and then forgets to shine. Everything continues, unhurried, content to be part of the same long exhale. Somewhere, a river folds itself into the dark and becomes sound without source. Somewhere, a dune holds its curve in perfect stillness, the wind asleep beside it. Ice keeps its blue quiet, rock keeps its slow grammar. The moon is a coin in an open palm. Inside this gentleness, the listener rests like a leaf in a broad, patient current. Thoughts arrive as shapes without sentences and pass like fish under a clear surface. There is nothing to keep and nothing to refuse. The field remains, uncomplicated and complete. Stone, water, air, light. The night carries everything lightly as if all weight were made of time and time were willing to be soft. Breath moves. The room is wider than rooms. The planet is steadier than names. Sleep approaches as a tide approaches, then touches, then becomes the shore itself. The listener drifts, and drifting becomes being, and being becomes a smooth, formless brightness. Just behind closed eyes, the world keeps turning. End of script. Sleep well.